After saying goodbye to my dying wife, I walked out of the hospital with tears streaming down my face. But when I overheard two nurses whispering about a shocking secret, I froze in disbelief. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Hollis. I am 69 years old, and I spent my entire life building a fortress to protect the people I love. I thought I had succeeded. I was wrong. The long, continuous tone of the heart monitor inside the intensive care unit pierced the heavy silence of the corridor. Nadine was gone. I stood at the threshold of her room for a fleeting second, staring at the empty space she left behind. I slid her gold wedding band off her cooling finger and closed my hand into a tight fist around it. The metal pressed sharply into my palm, grounding me in a reality I refused to accept. I turned my back on the flashing medical equipment and walked out of the room. I did not collapse. I did not scream. I bypassed the main waiting area, steering clear of the bright fluorescent lights and the sympathetic gazes of the medical staff. I needed a solitary moment. I ducked into a dim, recessed alcove near the supply closets to wipe the moisture from my eyes. The cold linoleum walls offered a harsh comfort. I leaned heavily against the corner, forcing my lungs to draw in the sterile antiseptic air. I told myself to breathe. I prepared to face my daughter and her husband. I expected to face grief. I never expected to face sudden, absolute betrayal. Two female voices drifted through the slightly open door of the medication station just feet away from my hiding spot. I stood entirely still, recognizing the voice of the head nurse who had monitored Nadine all week. She spoke in a hushed, anxious tone. She told her colleague that the sudden cardiac failure made zero medical sense. She revealed a terrifying detail. Nadine had a massive, unnatural spike in her potassium levels just minutes before her heart stopped beating entirely. The numerical values were physically impossible without direct external chemical intervention. My blood ran completely cold. I held my breath, pressing my shoulder harder against the concrete wall. The second nurse chimed in, her voice trembling with barely contained anger. She described a disturbing interaction that occurred an hour earlier. She stated that Kendra, my own flesh and blood, had cornered the attending physician in the sterile hallway. Kendra had been fiercely aggressive. She demanded the immediate execution of a do not resuscitate order. The second nurse emphasized how strangely calculating Kendra behaved. She did not act like a weeping, grieving child. She acted like an impatient executive closing a hostile corporate deal. The very second the primary doctor stepped away from the hospital bed to consult with a specialist, Kendra forcefully took over the room. The nurses agreed the precise timing was far too perfect to be a mere coincidence. The fatal potassium spike happened immediately after Kendra forcefully demanded total privacy with her vulnerable mother. They whispered about alerting the hospital administration, but fiercely feared the legal repercussions of making a baseless murder accusation against an arrogant white man like Blake, who had been flashing his tech startup credentials all morning. They ultimately decided to stay totally silent to protect their fragile careers. Every single word they spoke hammered into my brain like a physical blow. The brutal reality of their conversation completely obliterated my mourning process. My wife did not simply succumb to her illness. She was violently pushed over the edge by the daughter we had raised and the son-in-law I always despised. The grief instantly vanished from my system. A profound, calculating rage took its place. I did not rush out to confront them or demand any answers. I stood in the shadows and absorbed the grim reality of what had truly occurred. I was a man of action, not of useless outbursts. I processed the complex medical terminology instantly. The nurses assumed they were speaking in a code that an elderly, grieving man could never possibly understand. They were horribly wrong. I am not a simple antique restorer or a retired mechanic. I spent the first 2 decades of my long career designing the back-end security architecture for the largest hospital databases in the country. I built the very systems that govern the flow of patient data and medication tracking. I understood the lethal implications of a sudden potassium spike better than anyone else in this building. It was an execution. Confronting those terrified nurses right now would only cause panic. It would give Blake the opportunity to spin the narrative, hire an expensive crisis management team, and paint me as a delusional old man unable to cope with the tragic loss of his wife. I refused to hand my enemy such a distinct tactical advantage. The element of surprise was my greatest weapon. I slowly reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and retrieved my smartphone. My hands did not shake as I navigated the screen. I silently activated the encrypted voice recorder application. I held the device close to the gap in the doorway, maximizing the audio reception. I captured every single syllable of their hushed conversation, immortalizing their fears and their explicit suspicions in a high-definition digital file. I secured the initial evidence required to dismantle the people who had murdered my wife. I pressed the save button and slipped the phone safely back into my pocket. The trap had been effectively armed. I took one very slow, deep breath and stepped away from the alcove. I let the dark shadows conceal my movements as I prepared to face them on the main hospital floor right now. I stepped out of the secluded corridor and entered the bright, bustling main lobby. Kendra and Blake were sitting on a plush leather sofa, performing a disgusting display of exaggerated grief. Kendra buried her face in her hands, producing loud, theatrical sobs for the benefit of the passing medical staff. Blake rubbed her back with fake sympathy, playing the role of the devoted husband flawlessly. As I approached, Blake abruptly stood up. He patted Kendra on the shoulder, pulled his ringing cell phone from his tailored suit pocket, and stepped several feet away. He did not bother to lower his arrogant voice. He confidently answered the call, addressing a luxury real estate broker by name. He proudly assured the man on the other end of the line that the large suburban property would be entirely vacant and ready for listing by Monday morning at the absolute latest. He laughed loudly, a cruel, triumphant sound that echoed across the sterile lobby. My wife had been dead for less than 20 minutes, and the hostile takeover of my entire life had already officially begun. They assumed I was just a broken old man. They were about to learn the cold, absolute truth. The drive from the hospital to my house felt entirely detached from reality. The streets of our quiet suburban neighborhood looked exactly as they had this morning, yet the entire foundation of my world had been violently excavated. I pulled my truck into the driveway and noticed the front door standing slightly ajar. A cold draft swept through the entryway, carrying away the familiar scent of Nadine's vanilla and cedarwood candles. I stepped inside the silent house. The quiet was absolute, devoid of the soft hum of the oxygen concentrator that had been a fixture in our lives for the past 6 months. I walked down the hall toward my private study at the back of the house. I pushed the heavy oak door open and froze. The room was thoroughly ransacked. Books were shoved off the shelves and desk drawers hung open like broken jaws. My eyes immediately dropped to the floor. The heavy steel door of my restored 1920s mechanical floor safe swung wide open on its brass hinges. I had spent 3 full years sourcing original parts to rebuild that specific vault, marveling at the intricate, unyielding logic of its tumblers. It was designed to withstand a sledgehammer. It was not designed to withstand someone who knew my birthday. Financial documents, old tax returns, and deeply personal letters from Nadine were carelessly scattered across the hardwood floor like worthless trash. Someone had rummaged through the most private corner of my existence with absolute disregard for my privacy or my grief. The lock mechanism was not forced. It was expertly manipulated. I knelt on the floor, picking up a photograph of Nadine from our anniversary trip to Charleston. The glass frame was shattered. My grief hardened into a sharp clinical focus. Heavy footsteps echoed from the second floor. I stood up just as Blake casually walked down the main staircase. He was still wearing the dark suit he wore to the hospital, but his tie was loosened, and the top button of his shirt was undone. Tucked firmly under his right arm was a thick stack of manila folders. I instantly recognized the color coding on the tabs. They were the master files for my estate planning and Nadine's medical directives. He did not look like a man mourning the sudden loss of his mother-in-law. He looked like a corporate liquidator evaluating a newly acquired asset. He paused on the bottom step and let out a heavy theatrical sigh when he saw me standing in the hallway. He offered a tight, patronizing smile that did not reach his eyes. He explicitly told me he came over to proactively clear out the clutter. He claimed he wanted to spare me the intense emotional pain of dealing with Nadine's complicated estate while my heart was so fragile. His tone was infuriatingly smooth, dripping with an arrogance that assumed I was entirely incapable of managing my own life. He stepped closer, invading my personal space, and confidently stated he took the house deed and all the life insurance policies for ultimate safekeeping. He argued that an elderly man in deep mourning was highly prone to misplacing critical documents. He insisted he was lifting a massive burden off my shoulders. I looked at the folders secured under his arm and then looked directly into his face. The sheer audacity of his actions was breathtaking. He had bypassed my physical locks and raided my private vault while my wife's body was still resting in the hospital morgue. He was securing his financial leverage before the sun even went down. I knew perfectly well that handing over the deed and the insurance policies to a man who despised my very existence was absolute financial suicide. Yet I did not raise my voice. I did not demand my property back or accuse him of theft. To win this war, I needed him to believe his crude, aggressive tactics were working flawlessly. I let my shoulders slump forward perfectly, mimicking the posture of a broken, exhausted man who had entirely given up the fight. Blake took my silence as total submission. His fake sympathetic smile vanished, replaced by cold transactional authority. He crossed his arms and commanded me to go upstairs immediately to pack a small bag. He pointed toward the basement door at the end of the hall, instructing me to move my belongings down there tonight. My bedroom, the sanctuary I had shared with Nadine for 40 years, was no longer mine. Blake bluntly announced that professional contractors were arriving at dawn to completely gut and remodel the master suite. He planned to rent out the upper level of my home to generate immediate necessary revenue. He did not ask for my permission. He stated that his tech startup was bleeding capital, and this real estate asset was the only viable way to secure the cash flow his company desperately needed to survive the quarter. He justified the hostile takeover by claiming the large house was a massive waste of space for a single elderly man. He spoke to me as if I were a squatter on his personal property, an inconvenient obstacle standing between him and his financial salvation. My blood turned to ice, but I maintained my fragile facade. I looked at the basement door, then back at his arrogant, unyielding expression. A hot surge of defensive anger flared in my chest, but I forcefully suppressed it. Retaliating now would only trigger an escalating confrontation I was not yet fully prepared to execute. I bowed my head slightly, assuming the role of the utterly defeated patriarch. I simply nodded at my malicious son-in-law and quietly thanked him for taking control of the difficult arrangements during my darkest hour. My willing compliance fed his towering ego perfectly. Blake adjusted his suit jacket, turned on his heel, and walked out the front door without offering a single word of genuine condolence. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, leaving me entirely alone. I dropped the defeated posture instantly. My spine straightened. I walked back into my ravaged study and engaged the heavy brass deadbolt securing the room. I stepped over the scattered financial documents and sat behind my massive oak desk. I reached underneath the solid wood frame, pressing my fingers against a sequence of concealed pressure points. A hidden panel seamlessly slid open, revealing a compact state-of-the-art surveillance server running silently in the dark. I booted up the highly encrypted monitor and accessed the local camera feed stored exclusively on this isolated network. I rewound the timeline to exactly 1 hour ago. The high-definition footage clearly showed Blake kneeling in front of the vintage safe. He did not guess the combination. He used a specialized electronic manipulation tool to crack the tumbler. I watched the screen intensely as he rummaged through the interior compartments. He extracted a distinct red sealed envelope. He explicitly pocketed Nadine's original will, intentionally stealing the only document that protected my absolute legal sovereignty. The post-funeral dinner took place in the formal dining room under the soft glow of the large crystal chandelier Nadine had loved so much. The heavy mahogany table felt vast and deeply suffocating. The silence in the house was absolute. No one spoke of the beautiful eulogy or the vibrant life my wife had lived. Instead, the harsh clinking of silverware against fine china echoed like the relentless ticking of a countdown clock. Kendra sat directly across from me. She pushed her barely touched plate of roast beef aside and placed a thick leather-bound portfolio on the polished wood. She unclasped the metal binding and extracted a dense stack of legal papers. She did not offer a single word of comfort. She did not ask how I was holding up after burying her mother just hours ago. She locked her eyes onto mine with a cold, predatory focus. She slid the top document across the smooth surface of the table until it rested right next to my water glass. I glanced down at the bold black letters printed across the top margin. It was a general power of attorney. The document was aggressively comprehensive. It granted the bearer absolute, irrevocable control over my medical directives, my banking access, my retirement funds, my investments, and the legal deed to this very house. Kendra tapped her manicured fingernail against the designated signature line at the bottom of the page. She demanded that I sign over complete medical and financial control to her immediately. She explicitly stated that the grieving process was entirely too overwhelming for an elderly man to ever handle alone. Her tone was not compassionate. It was a thinly veiled command disguised as daughterly concern. I looked at the brutal legal trap and calmly met her cold gaze. Kendra leaned much closer across the dining table, her posture rigid and combative. She began to systematically dismantle my sanity with practiced, deliberate cruelty. She loudly claimed I was suffering from a rapid onset of severe dementia, pointing to my quiet demeanor during the funeral as absolute proof of cognitive decline. She told me my profound grief had transformed into a dangerous paranoia that made me a severe liability to myself. Her voice dripped with condescending pity as she insisted I could no longer be trusted to make rational choices regarding my own welfare. I did not even flinch. I did not raise my voice to defend my mental clarity. I simply allowed her to exhaust her poisonous rhetoric. Seeing that her emotional manipulation was failing to provoke an angry reaction from me, Blake decisively took over the negotiation. He slammed his fist onto the mahogany table. He aggressively threatened to drag me into a probate courtroom by force if I refused to cooperate peacefully. He boasted that he had already contacted a corrupt court-appointed psychiatrist who would willingly testify to my institutionalization based solely on their fabricated claims. He made it entirely clear that if I fought them, they would lock me away in a secure psychiatric ward and strip my assets through a drawn-out legal battle. Then, blinded by his own towering arrogance, Blake committed his fatal error. He proudly confessed their true motivation. He admitted his highly publicized software company was secretly bleeding capital and standing on the very brink of catastrophic bankruptcy. He explicitly stated they desperately needed to liquidate my sprawling suburban property immediately to secure a massive cash injection. He confessed that stealing my home was the only viable way to prevent his fraudulent tech startup from completely defaulting on its impending corporate obligations. He looked at me with a sickeningly triumphant smile, utterly convinced that his ruthless intimidation tactics had backed me into an inescapable corner. He truly believed that he had finally won. I stared right back at him, letting his brutal confession hang in the cold air. He had just voluntarily handed me the exact financial motive for his highly calculated murder. His desperate craving for rapid liquidity was the precise reason my vulnerable wife was violently rushed to the morgue. I meticulously memorized every single word. Their monumental greed completely blinded them to the lethal reality of their situation. I maintained an absolute unbreakable silence. I simply did not give them the satisfaction of a desperate plea or an angry outburst. I calmly reached into the inner breast pocket of my suit jacket and slowly retrieved my favorite vintage fountain pen. I had carried this specific brass pen for decades, using it exclusively for critical engineering blueprints and highly sensitive corporate contracts. I methodically unscrewed the heavy cap and placed it gently onto the table. I smoothed out the thick paper of the general power of attorney with my left hand. I positioned the gold nib over the designated signature line. Kendra leaned forward, holding her breath in eager anticipation of her massive financial victory. Blake crossed his arms, practically vibrating with arrogant satisfaction. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my full legal name with a remarkably steady, fluid motion. The black ink flowed perfectly across the document, permanently binding my vast estate to my treacherous daughter. I lifted the pen and capped it with a crisp click. Kendra did not even bother to wait for the ink to dry. She aggressively snatched the document away from me, clutching it to her chest as if she had just won a lottery jackpot. A sickeningly triumphant, arrogant smirk spread across her face. She looked at her husband and nodded approvingly. She quickly shoved the signed paper back into her leather portfolio and snapped the metal clasp shut. She confidently announced that they would handle the rest of the agonizing legal details so I could mourn in complete peace. She patted my hand with fake affection and told me to get some rest. I nodded quietly, offering them the flawless illusion of total submission. They stood up from the dining room table, walking away completely and absolutely victorious. Kendra and Blake practically skipped toward the front door, already whispering excitedly about contacting the real estate broker first thing tomorrow morning. The heavy door slammed shut behind them, plunging the dining room back into its cold, lingering silence. I remained seated perfectly still at the long mahogany table. I reached deep into my suit jacket pocket and pulled out a small microfiber cloth. I unscrewed my vintage fountain pen and calmly wiped the gold nib completely clean. They truly believed they had successfully stolen my entire life with a single stroke of a pen. They were foolishly unaware of my meticulous preparation. The thick black ink currently drying on that highly sensitive legal document was not standard stationary fluid. It was a highly specialized custom mixed thermal reactive compound I had personally engineered during my corporate years for supreme document security. Exposed to normal room temperature, the chemical structure degrades at a mathematically precise rate. That bold black signature sealing my financial doom will completely evaporate into thin air, leaving that crucial designated line entirely blank in exactly 24 hours. Their wildly premature celebration was merely a silent ticking time bomb. The real war was truly just beginning. I sat in the driver's seat of my heavy-duty truck parked under the flickering amber light of a street lamp just outside the regional hospital. The engine idled with a low, steady rumble, providing the only warmth against the biting evening chill. I pulled a secondary, untraceable, encrypted phone from my glove compartment. I did not call the local police. I did not call the primary physician. I dialed a direct private line to Dr. Eris Thorne, the hospital's head of toxicology and a trusted associate from my corporate days. He answered on the second ring. His voice lacked its usual booming confidence. Instead, a thick, palpable terror laced his hurried whispers. He explicitly told me he had gone to the laboratory servers to personally review Nadine's final metabolic panels after hearing rumors from the intensive care staff. He paused, his breath hitching over the encrypted connection. Dr. Thorne confessed that the digital files no longer existed. The comprehensive toxicology reports the raw blood data and the automated alerts detailing the fatal potassium spike had been completely eradicated from the central server. It was not a system glitch or a temporary server failure. Dr. Thorne stated the deletion was surgical, executed with administrative credentials to bypass all automated backup protocols. Someone had breached the hospital's secure network to meticulously scrub every single trace of the chemical anomaly that stopped my wife's heart. He warned me that pursuing the matter further could expose us both to severe legal and physical retaliation. He hung up the phone abruptly, severing the connection in sheer panic. I placed the phone on the passenger seat. The murder weapon was not a physical object left at a crime scene. It was a digital ghost, and the killer had attempted to bury it permanently today without any remorse. I reached toward my truck center console and pressed a concealed mechanical latch located just beneath the climate controls. The padded leather armrest smoothly folded backward, revealing a military-grade heavy-duty laptop seamlessly integrated into the reinforced dashboard framework. I flipped the thick composite screen open and powered up the customized operating system. The screen flared to life, casting a cold blue glow across the darkened cabin. I connected the device to a secure, untraceable satellite network I had established years prior to shield my most sensitive technical work. A prompt appeared demanding an authentication phrase. I typed it effortlessly. The hospital administrators falsely believed their modernized multi-million-dollar cybersecurity infrastructure was impenetrable. Their profound arrogance ignored the foundational architecture of their own data vaults. 20 years ago, my cybersecurity firm constructed the exact legacy framework their modern systems currently relied upon to function. When I drafted the original source code, I intentionally embedded several hidden backdoor master administrative keys into the foundational registry. These dormant pathways were designed strictly for emergency catastrophic recovery, completely invisible to routine network audits and undocumented in the corporate blueprints. I opened a terminal window and began injecting the archaic command scripts. Line after line of green text cascaded rapidly across the dark monitor as my proprietary software bypassed their outer firewalls without triggering a single automated security alarm. I slipped past the modernized encryption barriers like a phantom walking through solid concrete walls. Once inside the main directory, I navigated directly toward the central toxicology repository. The digital space where Nadine's final records should have existed was totally empty, wiped clean by a sophisticated destruction protocol. However, every digital action invariably leaves a distinct resonance within the underlying system registry. The intruder had successfully masked their surface identity, but they failed to scrub the secondary routing logs buried deep within the network hardware. I ran a targeted diagnostic sweep specifically designed to isolate and trace unauthorized remote data purges. The search algorithm crawled methodically through the labyrinth of hospital servers, cross-referencing the exact timestamp of the file deletion against external traffic entering the network. Within 3 tense minutes, my screen flashed with a confirmed match. The diagnostic tool successfully isolated the unique digital footprint of the remote administrator who initiated the data wipe. I stared at the raw numeric output, a cold sense of absolute validation washing over my mind. I highlighted the numerical Internet Protocol address displaying boldly on the glowing monitor. I initiated a secondary routing program to aggressively trace the connection backward through the labyrinth of regional Internet service providers. The tracer software aggressively bounced across local network hubs, shedding the encrypted layers the intruder had desperately utilized to conceal their true physical location. A green progress bar filled the top margin of my screen, eventually locking onto a definitive, unmasked geographical coordinate. The final destination was not a random overseas proxy server or an anonymous public terminal. The IP address mapped directly back to a private, highly secured server rack physically located in the downtown corporate headquarters of Blake's own technology startup. The magnitude of his supreme arrogance crystallized instantly in my mind. Blake did not hire an external mercenary or a dark web operative to erase the damning toxicology panels. He possessed such a profound delusion of invincibility that he literally executed a federal cybercrime from his own corporate office. He weaponized his company's proprietary networking software to forcefully hack into a vulnerable municipal hospital database, explicitly seeking to permanently obliterate the medical proof of Nadine's chemical execution. He had utilized his failing business infrastructure to commit and conceal a premeditated murder. The connection was absolutely undeniable. His corporate servers now contained the irrefutable mirrored digital evidence linking him directly to the catastrophic network breach that coincided precisely with my wife's unnatural death. I rested my hands on the keyboard, letting the sheer weight of his monumental stupidity wash over me. Blake believed he had perfectly outsmarted the system, relying on technical superiority to avoid conventional detection. He failed to realize he had just handed the original architect of that very system the precise digital weapon required to completely annihilate his entire personal existence forever. While I continuously siphoned the uncorrupted hospital access logs onto my hardened external drive, a secondary security alert unexpectedly flashed across the corner of my interface. My backdoor connection had automatically granted me unrestricted monitoring privileges across Blake's entire internal corporate network. I swiftly opened the Active Communications tab. A massive unencrypted data packet was currently transmitting directly from Blake's personal executive terminal. I seamlessly intercepted the outgoing message without disrupting the original routing pathway. It was an urgent, highly confidential email addressed directly to the senior acquisition board of a massive global venture capital firm. Blake was desperately pitching his company's core proprietary algorithm for an immediate high-value corporate buyout scheduled to occur first thing tomorrow morning. He arrogantly promised the investors an unprecedented technological breakthrough, completely unaware that his stolen software was built upon a foundation of absolute fraud. The email confirmed his entire desperate motive for murdering my vulnerable wife. He urgently required the immediate liquidation of my suburban estate to secretly bridge the severe financial deficit before ruthless corporate auditors discovered his company was totally insolvent. Tomorrow morning, his spectacular illusion of extreme corporate wealth would finally shatter completely, leaving him exposed to absolute ruin. The morning light poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of First Heritage Financial, illuminating the polished marble floors of the high-end commercial bank. Kendra and Blake sat comfortably in oversized leather chairs across from the senior branch manager. They projected absolute confidence. Kendra wore a tailored designer blazer, crossing her legs with the posture of a woman who had already won. Blake leaned casually against the edge of the heavy mahogany desk, radiating the arrogant energy of a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. He tapped his expensive silver watch against the wood, checking the time with performative impatience. The branch manager, a meticulously groomed man named Sterling, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and opened the leather portfolio Kendra had handed him. Inside rested the general power of attorney document. Blake spoke with a smooth, practiced authority. He explained that his elderly father-in-law was suffering from severe cognitive decline following the sudden death of his wife. Blake claimed they needed to instantly leverage a second mortgage on Hollis's suburban property to secure the necessary funds for a specialized full-time medical care facility. Kendra nodded in perfect unison, placing a comforting hand over her heart to emphasize her fabricated grief. They requested an immediate cash disbursement of $400,000 against the massive equity of the house. Sterling expressed his polite condolences for their recent family tragedy. He picked up the crisp document to officially verify the legal authorization. He turned the page to locate the notarized signature line. His professional smile completely vanished. He blinked, adjusting his glasses again as he stared at the bottom of the page. He flipped the paper over, assuming he had somehow misread the layout. He placed the document flat on his desk and looked up at the confident couple in silence. Sterling slid the legal paper back across the polished desk, his expression twisting into severe confusion. He pointed directly at the bottom margin. The signature line was entirely blank. The custom thermal ink Hollis had used the previous evening had evaporated flawlessly, leaving absolutely no trace of his name on the pristine white parchment. Kendra gasped, her jaw dropping open as she stared at the empty space. Blake instantly snatched the paper from the desk, his eyes widening in complete shock. He frantically rubbed his thumb over the blank line, desperately trying to reveal a signature that simply did not exist. Sterling stood up, his tone rapidly hardening into a state of icy professionalism. He sternly informed them that presenting a forged or incomplete power of attorney to extract hundreds of thousands of dollars was a severe federal offense. He explicitly threatened to call building security and alert the local police department for attempted bank fraud if they did not leave his office immediately. The accusation struck Blake like a physical blow, entirely shattering his composed corporate facade. His face flushed a dark red. He threw a violent, explosive tantrum right in the middle of the open banking floor. He wildly slammed his closed fist down onto Sterling's immaculate desk, knocking a crystal pen holder to the floor with a resounding crash. He began screaming at the top of his lungs, hurling vicious insults at the branch manager and aggressively demanding his money. His unhinged outburst echoed loudly throughout the expansive lobby, completely halting all business operations. Dozens of wealthy clients, corporate executives, and bank tellers stopped what they were doing to watch the shameful spectacle. Security guards in dark uniforms immediately began advancing toward the office. Kendra covered her face in burning humiliation, grabbing Blake by his suit sleeve and desperately pulling him away from the desk. She hissed at him to stop causing a scene, acutely aware of the wealthy socialites witnessing their absolute disgrace. Blake ripped his arm out of her grasp, his chest heaving with uncontrolled rage. He realized he looked like an unstable maniac, throwing a childish fit in front of the city's financial elite. The armed security guards forcefully ordered them to exit the premises without further delay. Blake snatched the worthless blank document off the desk and stormed out through the glass revolving doors, leaving a trail of shattered dignity in his wake. Blake stormed across the scorching pavement of the bank parking lot, kicking a loose pebble with explosive force. He ripped open the door of his sleek luxury car and threw himself into the driver's seat. He slammed his fists repeatedly against the leather steering wheel, hyperventilating as the suffocating reality of his impending financial ruin crushed his lungs. Kendra slid into the passenger side, cowering in terrified silence as her husband completely unraveled. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, his hands shaking with violent tremors. He aggressively punched the screen and dialed his father-in-law's number. He bypassed the long, ringing tones, waiting purely for the automated digital recording to begin. The moment Hollis's voicemail beeped, Blake unleashed a torrent of pure, concentrated venom. He screamed directly into the receiver, completely abandoning any remaining pretense of civility or familial respect. He explicitly accused Hollis of deploying an elaborate trick to maliciously sabotage his corporate future. Blake violently declared that the house legally belonged to him and Kendra, regardless of what the invalid paperwork claimed. His voice cracked with a terrifying, unhinged pitch as he escalated his hostile promises into direct threats of extreme physical violence. He ruthlessly promised to break every single bone in the old man's fragile body if he dared to stand in his way. He swore he was driving straight to the property to personally drag Hollis out the front door by his throat. He explicitly vowed to throw the grieving elderly widower onto the cold street tonight by absolute brutal force. Blake promised that neither the law nor any sentimental attachments would stop him from liquidating that real estate asset. He ended the deeply incriminating rant by violently punching the steering wheel one final time, completely unaware that he had just manufactured his own legal destruction. Hollis sat completely motionless inside the heavily armored cab of his parked truck, listening to the violently unhinged voicemail echoing through the speakers. He did not react to the vile threats or the promises of brutal physical harm. He remained an absolute picture of composed, calculated serenity. As the recording finally clicked to an end, Hollis tapped the screen to instantly transfer the audio file directly into his highly encrypted localized digital vault alongside the retrieved hospital logs. The digital trap was tightening perfectly around his arrogant son-in-law. A sharp chime broke the silence. His mobile phone rang immediately, displaying a secure private number. Hollis answered the secure call calmly. Attorney Gallagher spoke from the other end of the line, his tone brisk and entirely professional. Gallagher officially informed Hollis that the corporate trap had successfully sprung. Blake's struggling software company had just formally accepted the massive $20 million buyout offer directly from Vanguard Holdings. Blake had swallowed the financial bait without a single second of hesitation, blinded by his desperate need for immediate corporate liquidity. Hollis closed his eyes and allowed a cold, clinical smile to form on his face. The arrogant predator was walking blindly straight into the corporate slaughterhouse. I returned to the profound silence of my suburban home, waiting for the inevitable physical escalation. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, sharp shadows across the hardwood floors. I stood quietly near the stone fireplace in the main living room, hands resting calmly in my pockets. The heavy oak front door did not simply open. It violently splintered inward with a deafening crack. The brass deadbolt tore through the wooden frame, sending jagged shards flying across the entryway tile. Blake stormed into the house like an unleashed animal. He reeked of expensive scotch and raw, unadulterated panic. His tailored designer suit was disheveled, the expensive fabric wrinkled and stained. His face was flushed, a dangerous, chaotic red. He crossed the distance between the foyer and the living room in 3 massive strides. His eyes were wide and completely devoid of human empathy. He was entirely consumed by a blind, destructive rage fueled by his humiliating failure at the commercial bank earlier that afternoon. He did not ask for permission to enter my sanctuary. He aggressively closed the distance between us, backing me directly into the cold, rough stones of the fireplace mantel. The sheer heat radiating from his frantic body felt intensely oppressive. He trapped me against the masonry, cutting off any possible physical escape route. His breath smelled heavily of the high-end liquor he had undoubtedly used to drown his banking disgrace. He glared down at me, his chest heaving with frantic, uneven breaths. He was no longer playing the role of the mourning son-in-law or the polished tech executive. He was a desperate, cornered predator, realizing his financial survival depended entirely on breaking the elderly man standing quietly right in front of his flushed, enraged face. Blake lunged forward and grabbed me violently by the collar of my shirt. His large, sweating fists twisted the cotton fabric tight against my throat, painfully cutting off my vital air supply. He shoved me forcefully backward. My shoulder blades slammed exceptionally hard against the unforgiving stone mantel. He pressed his heavy forearm directly against my sternum, utilizing his significant physical weight advantage to firmly pin me in place. The expensive alcohol completely dissolved whatever fragile behavioral filter he still possessed. He maliciously unleashed a torrential barrage of vicious, unforgivable racial slurs. He explicitly degraded me as an uneducated blue-collar freeloader who had spent endless decades passively leeching off Nadine's incredible professional success. He mocked my consistently quiet demeanor, aggressively branding it as a disgusting display of pathetic weakness. He screamed that I did not deserve to inherit a single cent of the massive wealth my beautiful wife had accumulated over her long lifetime. His towering, unhinged arrogance demanded an absolute display of physical dominance over my life. He desperately wanted to crush my human spirit entirely. In a sudden fit of supreme, uncontrollable hubris, Blake leaned his flushed face mere inches from mine and violently crossed a horrific line he could never possibly uncross. He felt a deep, sick need to conclusively prove his absolute superiority. He explicitly screamed his darkest, most lethal secret directly into my face. He proudly confessed that he personally tampered with Nadine's intravenous medication pump in that isolated hospital room. He aggressively justified his monstrous, unforgivable action by declaring she was simply taking way too long to die naturally. He admitted his wealthy venture capital investors were growing incredibly impatient and actively threatening to completely pull their funding out of his software buyout entirely. He desperately needed the massive financial equity tied up in this very house to illegally secure his failing startup, and Nadine's stubborn refusal to pass away was actively jeopardizing his entire fraudulent corporate empire. He screamed that he executed her out of pure, unadulterated financial necessity, viewing her sacred human life as nothing more than a temporary, inconvenient obstacle blocking his ultimate path to extreme wealth. He sprayed saliva across my calm face as he loudly boasted about completely outsmarting the entire regional medical staff. He proudly detailed exactly how he injected the lethal dose of potassium to initiate the sudden cardiac arrest, firmly believing he had successfully won. I offered absolutely zero physical resistance throughout his entire terrifying psychological meltdown. I deliberately allowed my arms to hang loosely at my sides, refusing to raise my hands to block his aggressive shoving or wipe away his disgusting spittle. I maintained direct, unwavering eye contact with him, absorbing the absolute full magnitude of his horrifying arrogance without uttering a single syllable in my own defense. I wanted him to empty his corrupt soul entirely. I needed him to articulate every single twisted justification for murdering my beloved wife, so there could never be any ambiguity regarding his malicious, calculated intent. I simply stood there like a lifeless wooden pillar, expertly playing the role of the shattered, utterly defeated father-in-law he desperately believed me to be. My strategic silence only fueled his profound delusion of supreme, untouchable power. Exhausted from his own frantic screaming, Blake finally released his violent grip on my ruined collar. With one last disgusted grunt, he brutally shoved me away from the cold stone fireplace. I intentionally allowed my legs to buckle completely beneath me, collapsing awkwardly onto the solid hardwood floor to sell the pathetic illusion of my absolute physical submission. Blake scoffed down at me with pure, unadulterated contempt burning in his bloodshot eyes. He reached into his wrinkled suit jacket and violently threw a brand new, freshly printed legal transfer document directly onto the floor beside my hands. He kicked my knee sharply with his expensive leather shoe. He commanded me to stop stalling and finalize the property transfer immediately. He declared he was going to his car to retrieve a standard ballpoint pen. He gave me exactly 1 single hour to sign my name in permanent blue ink, or he would completely and legally destroy my entire miserable remaining life forever. Blake turned his back on me with a loud, disgusted scoff. He marched heavily down the front hallway and violently slammed the splintered oak door behind him, rattling the large windows in their frames. The moment the latch clicked, the pathetic, trembling posture entirely vanished from my aged body. I calmly sat up on the hardwood floor, brushing the dust from my slacks. I reached up with steady hands and meticulously straightened the ruined collar of my button-down shirt. I folded the torn fabric backward to expose the hidden inner lining. Pinned discreetly beneath the left lapel, completely invisible to the naked human eye, was a state-of-the-art, high-definition micro camera. The tiny, unblinking glass lens gleamed silently in the fading gray evening light. The device possessed advanced acoustic dampening microphones specifically designed for flawless close-quarters surveillance. Blake's entire horrific tirade was safely stored on the internal memory chip. Every single violent, vicious physical assault, every vile racial slur, and his explicit, unhinged medical murder confession were captured in absolutely perfect, undeniable 4,000-pixel resolution. I smiled coldly at the tiny black machine. I had just finally secured the ultimate, inescapable legal corporate guillotine. The polished steel doors of the private express elevator closed silently, sealing me securely inside the ascending glass cabin. I watched the digital floor indicator climb rapidly toward the penthouse level of the towering downtown structure. The smooth, frictionless ascent offered a stark contrast to the brutal, chaotic violence I had just endured in my own living room. My collar was meticulously straightened and my heartbeat remained entirely regulated. The hidden micro camera rested securely beneath my lapel, holding the digital execution warrant for the man who had just confessed to murdering my wife. The elevator slowed to a graceful halt and the doors glided open to reveal the immaculate reception area of Gallagher and Associates. The senior partners operated exclusively on this top floor, insulated by thick layers of frosted glass and acoustic paneling. Attorney Gallagher stood quietly waiting for me beside the massive tall windows of his primary conference room. The sprawling skyline of the city stretched out behind his tailored silhouette. He did not ask about my physical condition or the fresh bruise beginning to form on my shoulder blade. We had moved entirely beyond the realm of simple social pleasantries. Gallagher gestured respectfully toward the heavy mahogany table anchoring the center of the expansive room. I took my seat in the tall leather chair facing the panoramic view. Gallagher approached the opposite side of the long table carrying a thick, meticulously bound leather portfolio. He placed it carefully on the polished wood surface. With a precise, deliberate motion, he slid the heavy document directly across the table until it stopped perfectly in front of my hands. The gold-embossed lettering on the premium cover read Vanguard Holdings Acquisition Prospectus. The complex financial trap I had commanded him to construct was finally ready for my final review. Gallagher opened the thick folder and methodically laid out the highly confidential technical audit documents detailing the impending $20 million acquisition. He calmly revealed the complete, unvarnished truth regarding the revolutionary new software that had suddenly catapulted Blake's failing technology startup into the national spotlight. The core proprietary algorithm Blake was desperately attempting to sell to Vanguard Holdings was not a sudden stroke of entrepreneurial genius. It was a blatantly stolen piece of sophisticated intellectual property. Gallagher pointed to a heavily highlighted section of the detailed independent software code analysis printed securely on the desk. The unique structural architecture of the program matched an existing, highly classified corporate registry perfectly. I leaned forward and allowed a very cold clinical smile to form on my face as I examined the familiar strings of complex data. I knew every single hidden line of that specific code by heart. I wrote that exact open-source program 25 years ago while serving as the lead systems engineer for an emerging data security firm. The original patent remained legally bound to my personal identity, buried deep within a forgotten corporate archive that Blake believed he could safely exploit without ever being detected. He had maliciously raided my private study during my absolute darkest hours of grief, entirely convinced he was outsmarting an ignorant, technologically illiterate old man. Instead, he had ignorantly copied a dormant software architecture that I personally authored decades before he even graduated from college. The supreme, breathtaking irony of his massive criminal endeavor washed over me. Blake literally stole proprietary software directly from my own personal possession with the express intention of selling it directly back to my own private conglomerate. He was actively attempting to defraud Vanguard Holdings, completely oblivious to the devastating reality that I was the silent, absolute majority shareholder controlling that very institution. Gallagher watched my face closely, his posture completely rigid as he presented the final pages of the external audit. He explained that Vanguard's automated acquisition protocols immediately flagged the distinct irregularities buried deep within the submitted software compilation. Blake had desperately tried to mask the original coding signatures using basic encryption layers, but his amateur attempts were entirely useless against the sophisticated scanning mechanisms I had personally designed for Vanguard. The $20 million corporate buyout was nothing more than a spectacular, legally ruinous mirage built entirely upon a completely stolen digital foundation. Gallagher closed the comprehensive audit portfolio and folded his hands carefully over the premium leather cover. He looked directly across the conference table, his expression completely devoid of any personal emotion. He formally asked if he should immediately file a stringent legal injunction to completely block the pending corporate sale. He explained that a single aggressive cease and desist order from Vanguard Holdings would instantly paralyze Blake's entire operational capacity, publicly exposing his startup as a fraudulent criminal enterprise before the end of the business day. The legal mechanisms were already fully drafted and required nothing more than my verbal authorization to utterly annihilate Blake's business reputation. I stared out the massive penthouse windows, watching the sprawling city traffic moving silently far below. I slowly shook my head, absolutely refusing the straightforward legal option. A simple courtroom victory was entirely insufficient punishment for the monster who had violently assaulted me and intentionally murdered my beautiful wife in cold blood. I commanded Gallagher to completely ignore the blatant intellectual property theft for now. I ordered him to actively expedite the final closing process, instructing Vanguard's aggressive acquisition team to eliminate any remaining bureaucratic hurdles blocking the deal. Then, I delivered my ultimate directive. I told Gallagher to immediately process and approve Blake's urgent request for a massive high-interest bridge loan to heavily fund his arrogant victory celebration. I specifically instructed him to ensure the loan was exclusively collateralized against every single remaining asset Blake currently owned pending his final digital signature. I wanted Blake to blindly accept millions of dollars in toxic, unforgivable corporate debt just moments before the floor entirely collapsed beneath his feet. Gallagher simply nodded, perfectly understanding the extreme, completely devastating magnitude of the ruthless financial trap I had just ordered him to spring into action today. I remained seated in the quiet penthouse, meticulously planning the exact sequence of his total destruction. I absolutely needed Blake to formally sign the final Vanguard acquisition contract tomorrow morning in front of the entire executive board. The higher he arrogantly climbed toward his massive perceived victory, the more unimaginably devastating his inevitable catastrophic drop would ultimately become. He desperately craved the validation of supreme wealth, and I was going to let him taste it right before I completely shattered his entire world. Gallagher opened his secure laptop, his fingers gliding efficiently across the quiet keyboard. He swiftly drafted the official approval email, finalizing the immediate transfer of the massive high-interest bridge loan directly into Blake's corporate account. He verified the lethal liquidation clauses were hidden perfectly within the dense technical jargon of the digital paperwork. Gallagher firmly pressed the send button, transmitting the financial poison instantly. Exactly 30 seconds later, an automated alert chimed sharply on the conference monitor. Blake had already opened the email and eagerly executed the binding digital signature without a single hesitation. The arrogant predator had blindly swallowed the massive toxic financial bait, completely and permanently sealing his own inescapable, exceptionally brutal corporate demise. The surprising invitation arrived via a highly unusual brief text message proposing a peaceful family reconciliation over a quiet dinner. The designated location was an exclusive Michelin-starred French restaurant situated on the top floor of a downtown high-rise. I arrived precisely on time and found Kendra already seated at a secluded corner table overlooking the illuminated city skyline. She wore a stunning emerald green silk dress that draped perfectly across her shoulders. Her neck and wrists sparkled with heavy, flawless diamond jewelry that I knew she had purchased just hours ago. The extravagant gems were directly funded by the massive high-interest corporate bridge loan her husband had so arrogantly signed for earlier that afternoon. She waved me over with a patronizingly sweet theatrical smile, acting as though the violent, unhinged physical assault in my living room had absolutely never happened. She gestured for me to sit in the plush velvet chair opposite her and immediately poured me a glass of crisp, sparkling water. Her entire demeanor was dripping with a sickly, artificial affection, carefully designed to project the flawless image of a deeply caring daughter to the surrounding wealthy patrons. She reached across the crisp white linen tablecloth and patted my hand with a gentle, reassuring rhythm. She softly claimed that the intense stress of mourning her mother had unfortunately caused everyone to act entirely irrationally. She apologized for Blake's previous emotional outburst, casually dismissing his terrifying, violent behavior as a simple byproduct of extreme corporate pressure and profound grief. Her voice remained incredibly soothing and utterly devoid of any genuine human remorse. She sat there, radiating the blinding, supreme confidence of a woman who fully believed she was celebrating a monumental financial victory. She smiled brightly, completely unaware that her breathtaking new diamonds were entirely purchased with toxic, unrecoverable debt. The waiter arrived to serve our delicate seafood appetizers, silently interrupting her meticulously calculated monologue. Kendra paused, perfectly maintaining her bright plastic smile until the waiter retreated into the busy restaurant. The moment we were completely alone again, her sweet demeanor immediately shifted into a cold, ruthless business transaction. She reached into her expensive designer handbag and casually extracted a folded, glossy brochure. She slid the cheap paper directly across the pristine white tablecloth until it bumped gently against my plate. I glanced down at the poorly printed cover. It displayed a generic, highly edited photograph of a notoriously underfunded state-run nursing facility located in the absolute worst industrial sector of the city. The building was universally known for its atrocious living conditions and severe medical neglect. Kendra leaned forward, her heavy diamond necklace catching the ambient light. She maintained a chillingly calm, conversational tone as she informed me that heavy demolition crews were officially scheduled to arrive at my suburban property precisely at dawn tomorrow morning. She explicitly stated that Blake had already legally bypassed the tedious probate delays and successfully secured emergency municipal authorization to bulldoze the entire estate to clear the valuable land for an immediate, highly lucrative commercial sale. She told me the beloved family house would be completely reduced to unrecognizable rubble within 24 hours. She tapped her manicured fingernail against the glossy brochure, issuing her final devastating command. She confidently expected me to immediately gather whatever pathetic, miserable belongings I could physically carry and take a cheap yellow taxi directly to that wretched, miserable facility completely alone tonight. She had the absolute audacity to frame this cruel forced eviction as a profound act of daughterly mercy, aggressively claiming my rapidly failing mind required immediate institutional containment for my own personal safety. She explicitly stated she was generously sparing me the terrible, humiliating indignity of wandering the dark streets totally homeless and confused. She leaned back in her plush velvet chair, thoroughly satisfied with her monstrously calculated cruelty. Without waiting for a single word of my response, she elegantly signaled the passing sommelier with a raised hand. She confidently ordered a $300 bottle of exclusive imported vintage champagne to publicly celebrate the complete permanent destruction of my entire earthly existence. She believed she possessed absolute control, totally unaware of the digital guillotine suspended directly above her neck, waiting patiently to sever her absolutely perfect illusion forever. I did not display a single ounce of anger or betrayal. I maintained an unbreakable facade of complete hollow submission. The waiter returned, pouring the expensive vintage champagne into 2 tall crystal flutes before retreating once again. I ignored the bubbling alcohol entirely. I quietly picked up my heavy silver fork and methodically finished the remainder of my delicate seafood appetizer. I chewed each and every delicate bite incredibly slowly, letting the profound silence actively build the suffocating tension between us. Kendra watched me intently over the rim of her glass, searching my tired face for any trace of defensive rebellion. I offered her absolutely nothing. I gently placed my heavy polished silver cutlery perfectly parallel across the porcelain plate to silently signal my meal was definitively finished. I reached across the pristine tablecloth, grasped a white linen napkin, and calmly wiped my mouth clean. I picked up the glossy, poorly printed brochure for the wretched state-run nursing facility. I deliberately folded the thick paper precisely in half, creasing the edge firmly with my thumb, and tucked it safely inside the inner breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I looked directly into my daughter's cold, expectant eyes and softly agreed to vacate the suburban family estate completely tonight without offering a single legal or physical fight. Kendra exhaled a massive, dramatic sigh of absolute relief. The rigid, aggressive posture entirely melted from her shoulders. She leaned back against the plush velvet chair, taking a long, deeply satisfied sip of her expensive champagne. She was entirely convinced that her cruel emotional manipulation had successfully conquered her broken father. She believed I had finally surrendered my entire life to her absolute financial authority. She smiled radiantly, completely oblivious to the catastrophic financial avalanche currently hurtling directly toward her luxurious stolen world. Kendra reached lazily into her designer clutch and carelessly tossed a crumpled $20 bill directly onto the center of the tablecloth. She explicitly stated the meager cash was to generously cover my cheap taxi fare to the miserable nursing facility tonight. Her condescending smirk was an absolute picture of supreme, unadulterated arrogance. I looked at the wrinkled bill, offering her one final knowing nod. I calmly stood up from the plush velvet chair, reached across the table, and smoothly pocketed the $20. I straightened my tailored suit jacket, turned my back on my treacherous daughter, and walked confidently out the elegant glass front doors of the Michelin-starred restaurant. I stepped into the cool, refreshing evening air, leaving Kendra sitting utterly alone at the secluded corner table. She was still completely oblivious to the impending massive disaster waiting patiently for her inside that heavy leather check presenter. She was happily preparing to aggressively foot an exorbitant $700 dinner bill using an exclusive premium corporate business credit card that was literally moments away from a catastrophic, utterly humiliating public decline. The master key to Blake's accounts had just been triggered. The absolute, unforgiving financial slaughter had finally and officially commenced tonight. The pale morning sun had barely crested the eastern horizon when I turned my heavy truck onto the familiar cobblestone driveway of my suburban estate. The tranquil dawn silence was violently shattered by the harsh, rhythmic thud of heavy sledgehammers striking solid wood and plaster. Dust plumed from the open front doors, swirling into the cool morning air like thick gray smoke. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked deliberately toward the entrance. Blake had wasted absolutely no time executing his malicious directive. A rogue demolition crew, entirely unauthorized and operating well outside of standard municipal working hours, had already breached the perimeter. I stepped through the shattered oak doorway and into my main living room. The beautiful, pristine space where my wife and I had spent decades building our peaceful lives was rapidly becoming an unrecognizable war zone. 3 massive laborers in stained high-visibility vests were systematically annihilating the custom drywall with brutal sweeping swings of their heavy iron tools. Shards of plaster and splintered wood rained down onto the polished hardwood floors, permanently scarring the elegant finish. They were tearing the house apart from the inside out, blindly following the desperate illegal orders of a man who believed he was utterly untouchable. The sheer physical destruction was jarring, a visceral manifestation of Blake's unhinged greed and absolute panic. I did not raise my voice over the deafening crashes. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my jacket, bypassing the loaded micro camera, and withdrew the original unalterable property deed. I stood perfectly still amidst the swirling chaos of destruction, allowing the abrasive dust to settle on my shoulders as I locked my eyes on the lead contractor. I prepared to completely halt their highly illegal, entirely unjustified assault immediately, without any further delay whatsoever today. I smoothly unfolded the crisp, notarized property deed and stepped directly into the path of the nearest swinging sledgehammer. The massive laborer violently jerked his heavy tool backward, narrowly missing my shoulder as he stumbled onto the debris. The sudden chaotic movement caught the immediate attention of the burly, bearded foreman supervising the destruction from the hallway. He marched aggressively toward me, wiping thick white plaster dust from his face while loudly demanding to know who I was. I did not waste a single breath on useless emotional pleasantries. I coldly thrust the verified, unassailable legal document directly into his thick chest. I spoke with a quiet, terrifying authority that instantly cut right through the deafening mechanical noise. I clearly informed him that he was currently executing an unauthorized demolition upon my private, legally owned residential estate without a single valid municipal permit. I explicitly promised to immediately press severe criminal trespassing charges and absolutely bankrupt his entire construction company if he did not cease his illegal operations this very second. The foreman quickly scanned the certified paperwork, his aggressive demeanor evaporating into sheer, unadulterated panic. He realized instantly that Blake had completely lied about possessing the legal property rights. He frantically blew a shrill silver whistle, waving his arms wildly to completely halt the destructive work. The sledgehammers dropped to the hardwood floor with heavy thuds, plunging the ruined living room into an eerie, suffocating silence. Without waiting for their frantic apologies, I walked confidently through the lingering, thick gray dust and navigated the fractured hallway leading directly into Nadine's previously immaculate private study. The sheer devastation here was absolutely heartbreaking to witness. The delicate floral wallpaper she had meticulously chosen was brutally torn, and the custom mahogany desk was flipped carelessly onto its side. I stepped carefully over the shattered glass of her beloved antique reading lamp. I locked my eyes firmly on the heavy, built-in solid oak bookshelf dominating the far wall. The demolition crew had completely stripped the surrounding drywall, exposing the bare wooden studs. They were mere seconds away from aggressively dismantling the massive fixture itself. I took a deep, steadying breath, immensely grateful that my precise timing had successfully prevented the ultimate irreplaceable loss. I approached the sturdy, ornate bookshelf, ignoring the heavy destruction surrounding me. The true objective of my urgent morning arrival remained entirely untouched, waiting silently within the solid ancient wood. I knelt down onto this dusty hardwood floor and reached beneath the lowest shelf of the massive oak fixture. I ran my fingertips precisely along the intricate hand-carved wooden molding until I located the concealed microscopic mechanical latch. I firmly pressed the hidden mechanism inward. A perfectly camouflaged false bottom smoothly dropped open with a quiet, satisfying click entirely circumventing any visual detection. I carefully reached inside the dark, recessed compartment and confidently extracted a heavy, rubberized, hard-shell external digital drive. I gently wiped a thin layer of plaster dust off its matte black casing. The small, unassuming electronic device was my absolute ultimate safeguard. Weeks ago, immediately following my beloved wife's tragic admission into the intensive care unit, I had proactively established a deeply covert encrypted data link directly to the medical facility's internal surveillance grid. While Blake desperately hacked the hospital servers to maliciously eradicate Nadine's final toxicology reports, he was entirely oblivious to the localized independent backup system I had personally constructed. This specific external drive contained the perfectly mirrored high-definition digital recording of the comprehensive security camera feed continuously monitoring her private hospital room on the exact night she was murdered. The irrefutable crystal-clear video evidence of Blake physically tampering with her lethal intravenous medication pump was safely preserved within this isolated, impenetrable mechanical vault. The uncorrupted data remained entirely untouched, completely quarantined from his amateur remote network breach. He arrogantly believed his destructive cyber attack had successfully annihilated the only existing proof of his horrific violent crime. He was spectacularly, catastrophically wrong. I held the incredibly heavy, undeniable truth securely in my right hand, deeply feeling the immense, crushing weight of my impending, absolutely perfect corporate and legal vengeance finally materializing flawlessly and completely before my very own eyes right now. I smoothly slipped the thick digital drive securely into my tailored inner jacket pocket, hiding the irrefutable video evidence right next to my pounding chest. The chaotic noise of the terrified construction crew retreating completely outside faded into the quiet suburban air. Suddenly, my encrypted mobile phone vibrated sharply against my hip, demanding my immediate attention. I withdrew the slim device from my dark trousers and quickly tapped the glowing screen to unlock the secured messaging application. It was an urgent, highly confidential text message dispatched directly from Attorney Gallagher's private server. The notification contained only one single incredibly devastating sentence. It explicitly confirmed that Blake had just legally signed the massive high-interest bridge loan utilizing his entire failing software company as the absolute financial collateral. I smiled coldly at the bright digital text illuminating the dark, dusty study. Blake had blindly authorized his own spectacular execution. He had voluntarily surrendered every single remaining corporate asset directly to my waiting hands. The trap was now permanently locked, binding him completely to a ruinous contract he could never escape. My ultimate meticulously calculated revenge was finally fully armed and absolutely ready to strike perfectly against his utterly wretched life today. The atmosphere inside the downtown headquarters of Blake's technology startup was absolutely electric with premature victory. A massive catered celebration was currently in full swing across the expansive open-concept floor plan. Sleek laser lights pulsed through the room, cutting through the thick bass of the expensive sound system Blake had rented exclusively for tonight. Dozens of young, ecstatic employees clinked imported crystal champagne flutes, loudly toasting to their impending, unimaginable wealth. Blake stood at the center of the chaotic room, entirely intoxicated by the worshipful gazes of his subordinate staff. He raised his glass high above his head, soaking in the thunderous applause of the crowd. He delivered a roaring, deeply arrogant speech detailing how his unmatched entrepreneurial genius had successfully secured the monumental Vanguard Holdings acquisition. He explicitly boasted that their proprietary algorithm was about to change the global digital landscape forever. He projected the flawless image of a visionary corporate titan who had conquered the entire industry through sheer, unrelenting intellect. He completely masked the horrifying reality that his entire empire was constructed entirely on a foundation of intellectual property theft and the calculated violent murder of his vulnerable mother-in-law. The loud cheers swelled as catering staff carrying silver platters of premium caviar seamlessly navigated through the packed room. Blake reveled in the luxurious spectacle he had purchased with stolen time. The desperate, suffocating panic he had felt earlier today during the humiliating confrontation at the commercial bank was now completely eradicated by the intoxicating promise of endless corporate riches. He felt utterly invincible standing at the absolute pinnacle of his fraudulent success. He excused himself from the adoring crowd with a charming practiced smile, signaling that it was finally time to finalize the absolute masterpiece of his financial dominance. He turned his back on the lively celebration. Blake stepped confidently away from the thumping music and entered the pristine quiet of his private soundproof glass office. He closed the heavy door, sealing away the noisy celebration to focus entirely on his immediate financial salvation. He practically jogged toward his massive glass desk, his heart hammering with intense, greedy anticipation. A sleek silver laptop rested in the center of the desk, its bright screen displaying a highly confidential urgent email from an obscure offshore financial firm. The message contained the final binding digital contract for a massive $5 million bridge loan. This specific capital injection was the exact absolute financial lifeline Blake desperately required to temporarily pacify his highly aggressive, threatening investors and fund his extravagant victory tour until the massive Vanguard Holdings acquisition formally finalized. He dropped heavily into his plush executive chair and greedily clicked the attached legal document. The complex multi-page contract instantly populated his screen, entirely filled with incredibly dense legal terminology and dense formatting. Blake scoffed out loud, utterly refusing to waste his valuable evening reviewing mundane bureaucratic details. In his absolute towering arrogance, he forcefully scrolled straight past dozens of critical pages, completely ignoring every single explicit warning and severe financial condition outlined within the text. His profound hubris blinded him to the most crucial, meticulously hidden stipulation buried deeply within the exact center of the contract. He carelessly skipped right over the ironclad, non-negotiable clause explicitly demanding the immediate catastrophic liquidation of his entire company and all personal assets in the direct event of any proven intellectual property fraud. He did not read the lethal terms of service. He simply scrolled aggressively to the very bottom margin and eagerly typed his full legal name into the designated digital signature box. He clicked the bright green submission button with a violent, triumphant strike of his index finger. The screen instantly flashed a brilliant confirmation message officially binding him to the incredibly toxic, inescapable corporate trap. Blake leaned back in his leather chair, exhaling a massive sigh of profound, euphoric relief. He genuinely believed he had just brilliantly secured his entire future. He smugly adjusted his expensive designer tie, completely unaware that he had just voluntarily signed his own absolute irrevocable death warrant. He turned his arrogant gaze back toward the chaotic, loud party happening outside his glass walls, fully ready to enthusiastically celebrate his massive, totally fabricated corporate victory tonight. The scene cut sharply back across the sprawling city, to the secure, isolated executive suite where Hollis sat in absolute silence. He remained perfectly motionless behind a massive oak desk, staring intensely at a glowing, highly encrypted monitor. The screen displayed a direct, real-time feed of the offshore financial server he covertly controlled. He watched with a cold, calculated precision as Blake's digital signature officially registered across the secure network. The bold black letters of his son-in-law's name materialized permanently on the electronic contract, officially binding the arrogant tech executive to the ruinous stipulations. Hollis did not smile. He did not celebrate. He simply felt the crushing weight of absolute, undeniable justice finally locking firmly into place. He leaned forward and placed his index finger directly over the heavy authorization key on his keyboard. He physically pressed the button downward with a resounding definitive click. The secure system instantly processed the massive corporate transaction. A bright green notification bar flashed across his dark screen, officially confirming the immediate, unalterable transfer of funds. The full $5 million dropped directly into Blake's vulnerable corporate account. The massive bridge loan was now fully active, legally weaponizing the stolen intellectual property clause against Blake's entire fraudulent empire. Hollis watched the digital numbers finalize, knowing that every single dollar represented another fatal strike against the man who had violently murdered his beloved wife. The trap was meticulously baited, set, and now fully armed. Blake possessed the money he desperately craved, completely unaware that his temporary financial relief was actually the exact instrument of his total annihilation. Hollis calmly folded his hands together upon the polished desk, staring at the screen with the icy patience of a master hunter. The final phase of his meticulous, brutal retribution was now completely unstoppable, everywhere, forever tonight. Blake eagerly grabbed his smartphone from the glass desk, his hands shaking with pure adrenaline. He quickly captured a bright, high-definition screenshot of the massively inflated corporate bank balance. He immediately texted the irrefutable financial proof directly to Kendra, eager to share their absolute triumph. He added a short, profoundly arrogant caption explicitly declaring that their severe financial struggles were officially over forever. Across town, Kendra sat alone in their lavishly decorated master bedroom, admiring her newly purchased designer jewelry. Her phone chimed loudly. She opened the text and gasped at the stunning numeric display filling her screen. A vicious, intensely satisfied smirk spread across her face. She swiftly replied to her husband with a single, highly confident sentence. She explicitly declared that they were finally absolutely untouchable by anyone. Blake read her text and laughed loudly, entirely consumed by his blinding hubris. He locked his phone and confidently adjusted his suit jacket, preparing to return to the loud, ecstatic party happening right outside his door. The official, highly publicized signing ceremony directly with Vanguard Holdings was strictly scheduled for tomorrow morning. The absolute pinnacle of their massive corporate success was finally within their greedy, bloody reach right now. Friday morning broke with a piercing, cold clarity across the city skyline. The absolute pinnacle of Blake and Kendra's fabricated corporate ascension culminated inside the immense glass-walled boardroom of Vanguard Holdings. The sprawling high-altitude sanctuary was a masterclass in aggressive corporate intimidation, featuring a massive singular slab of polished mahogany serving as the central conference table. Blake sat near the head of the pristine table, exuding a toxic, supreme arrogance. He wore a brand-new, custom-tailored Italian suit purchased exclusively for this momentous occasion, his posture radiating the smug entitlement of a man entirely convinced of his own unmatched brilliance. He rhythmically tapped an expensive gold pen against the wood, eager to permanently finalize the $20 million acquisition that would instantly elevate him into the financial elite. Kendra sat perfectly poised directly beside him, wearing a stunning designer dress that flawlessly complemented her recently acquired heavily financed diamond jewelry. She projected the meticulously curated image of a deeply supportive, highly successful corporate partner. She casually scrolled through her smartphone, actively ignoring the sweeping panoramic views of the bustling financial district located 80 floors below their leather chairs. They were entirely insulated within their private bubble of monumental greed, blissfully unaware of the catastrophic avalanche currently suspended directly above their heads. The heavy double doors of the boardroom remained securely closed, building a palpable, thrilling anticipation within the quiet room. Blake leaned over and whispered a highly confident, victorious remark into Kendra's ear, prompting a sharp, arrogant laugh from his perfectly groomed wife. They genuinely believed the absolute hardest part of their ruthless endeavor was completely finished forever. They sat together in supreme comfort, fully expecting a grand parade of wealthy senior executives to march directly through those doors bearing champagne and a highly lucrative, completely finalized buyout contract, right here immediately today. The heavy mahogany double doors finally clicked open, decisively shattering the quiet anticipation filling the expansive boardroom. The Vanguard Holdings lead corporate auditor stepped into the pristine room. He did not bring a silver tray of chilled celebratory champagne. He did not offer a single warm word of congratulations to the eager couple. He walked with a chilling mechanical precision, projecting an aura of absolute, uncompromising authority. Two silent, broad-shouldered corporate security officers stepped into the room immediately behind him, taking up rigid positions flanking the exit. The auditor carried only a slim, dark electronic tablet and a single manila folder. Blake's arrogant, triumphant smile faltered slightly, his keen, predatory instincts finally registering the sudden, drastic shift in the atmospheric tension. The auditor bypassed the empty leather chairs and walked directly toward the sophisticated control podium situated at the far end of the long conference table. He seamlessly connected his encrypted tablet to the internal network without issuing a preliminary greeting. The massive high-definition wall screen dominating the entire right side of the boardroom instantly flared to life. The display bypassed the standard corporate welcoming graphics and immediately initiated a highly complex, automated software diagnostic sequence. Rows of dense, rapidly scrolling algorithmic data flooded the enormous monitor. The auditor calmly adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and tapped a final command sequence onto his screen. He officially announced that Vanguard Holdings employed an uncompromising proprietary forensic scanning protocol designed explicitly to verify the absolute structural integrity of all acquired technological assets. The scrolling code on the massive wall screen abruptly halted. A blindingly bright, violently flashing red warning banner instantly materialized across the entire center of the display. The digital alarm explicitly detailed a catastrophic legal failure. The diagnostic system definitively flagged the core proprietary algorithm Blake was aggressively attempting to sell for $20 million as a massively stolen, completely unauthorized piece of registered intellectual property. The system highlighted the exact lines of heavily encrypted source code, actively stripping away Blake's amateur digital camouflage to reveal the raw, unalterable foundational architecture underneath. The undeniable glowing red evidence of massive corporate fraud illuminated the terrified, rapidly paling faces of the suddenly silent couple. The auditor turned away from the blazing monitor and locked his cold, merciless gaze directly onto Blake. He officially stated that Vanguard Holdings does not purchase stolen technological assets under any conceivable circumstances whatsoever. He demanded an immediate explanation. Blake violently launched himself out of the plush leather chair, slamming his palms aggressively down onto the polished mahogany table. He wildly denied the catastrophic accusations, screaming at the absolute top of his lungs that the automated diagnostic system was entirely defective. He frantically waved his arms loudly, claiming the blinking red warning banner was merely a temporary, insignificant software glitch that his elite development team could effortlessly patch within a single hour. He desperately demanded that the auditor completely ignore the massive digital alarm and officially proceed with the scheduled $20 million financial transaction immediately. His voice cracked with an unhinged, terrified pitch as he viciously threatened to launch a monumental defamation lawsuit against Vanguard Holdings for actively insulting his impeccable professional integrity. The lead corporate auditor remained perfectly motionless, entirely unaffected by the chaotic, desperate outburst unfolding before him. He did not offer a single word of useless debate or professional reassurance. He calmly opened the plain manila folder he had carried into the expansive boardroom. He extracted a crisp, legally certified document bearing a very official government registry seal. He silently slid the original, perfectly verified patent file directly across the smooth mahogany table until it stopped perfectly in front of Blake's shaking hands. Blake aggressively snatched the thick paper from the wood, his eyes darting frantically across the dense legal text to locate the designated registration information. He completely and instantly stopped breathing. The undeniable absolute truth of his catastrophic failure was permanently bound to the page. The original brilliant software architect and sole registered owner of the foundational algorithm was not a nameless corporate ghost or a forgotten bankrupt competitor. The true patent holder's full legal name was boldly printed in unalterable black ink right across the very top margin. It unequivocally read precisely Hollis Vance. The lead auditor reached calmly into his tailored suit jacket and smoothly retrieved the final unsigned $20 million acquisition contract. Maintaining unwavering icy eye contact with the trembling tech executive, the auditor deliberately grasped the thick stack of premium paper with both hands. He forcefully tore the entire lucrative corporate agreement perfectly in half. The sharp, violent sound of ripping paper echoed brutally through the absolute silence of the glass-walled boardroom. The auditor decisively dropped the ruined, worthless shreds of the contract directly onto the polished mahogany table. He officially declared that the highly anticipated financial deal was permanently and completely terminated, effective immediately. Kendra covered her mouth with her trembling, diamond-clad hands, a muted gasp escaping her lips as she watched her entire luxurious future vaporize into thin air. Blake remained entirely frozen, his eyes locked desperately onto the bold, black ink displaying his father-in-law's name on the certified patent document. The warm blood drained entirely from his flushed face, leaving behind a sickly, terrifying pallor. The massive, lethal realization finally struck his arrogant mind with the crushing, inescapable force of a devastating physical blow. He had just blindly stolen absolutely everything from the brilliant silent software architect here today. The polished stainless steel doors of the massive Vanguard Holdings Express elevator slid completely shut, sealing Blake and Kendra inside a suffocating, soundproof metallic tomb. The smooth, frictionless descent engaged immediately, dropping them rapidly from the 80th floor toward the subterranean parking garage. Neither of them spoke a single word. The deafening silence inside the descending cabin perfectly mirrored the absolute void where their luxurious future had existed just 3 minutes prior. Blake leaned his heavy weight against the cold steel wall, his expensive Italian suit suddenly feeling like a suffocating straitjacket. He stared blankly at the digital floor indicator, his mind completely paralyzed by the catastrophic reality of the torn acquisition contract lying on the mahogany boardroom table. He had arrogantly built his entire corporate empire upon a stolen foundation, completely underestimating the silent, brilliant architect he had ruthlessly targeted. Kendra stood rigidly in the center of the elevator, her manicured fingers gripping her designer clutch with a terrifying, white-knuckled intensity. Her perfectly curated facade of supreme confidence was entirely shattered, replaced by a raw, consuming panic. The heavy diamond jewelry resting against her collarbone suddenly felt like a tightening noose. Suddenly, the oppressive silence was violently punctured by a sharp, relentless mechanical buzzing. Blake's customized smartphone erupted inside his tailored jacket pocket. The continuous aggressive vibrations signaled a massive coordinated digital assault. He reached inside his coat with a severely trembling hand and slowly extracted the glowing device. The bright screen was completely overwhelmed by a rapid, unceasing cascade of critical banking alerts. High-priority push notifications flooded the display in a blinding sequence of bright red emergency banners. Dozens of automated financial warnings aggressively stacked on top of one another, violently demanding his immediate, utterly desperate attention before the elevator had even physically reached the designated ground floor. The offshore lender had ruthlessly triggered the lethal liquidation clause embedded deeply within the digital contract Blake had arrogantly signed without reading. The automated security systems monitoring Vanguard's global acquisition network had instantaneously flagged his core algorithm as definitively stolen intellectual property, immediately transmitting the irreversible fraud alert directly back to the merciless foreign lending firm. The punishing consequences were executed with absolute brutal algorithmic efficiency. The entire $5 million bridge loan was aggressively called in for immediate non-negotiable repayment. Blake stared at the blinding screen, his lungs completely incapable of drawing oxygen as he frantically tapped the icon for his primary corporate banking application. The loading icon spun for one agonizing second before revealing a catastrophic sea of red zeros. His massive corporate accounts were entirely frozen, locked behind impenetrable administrative firewalls. The massive operational payroll designated for his ecstatic celebrating employees was completely locked and entirely inaccessible. Every single dollar of corporate liquidity had been aggressively seized by the offshore firm's automated collection software. Blake desperately navigated through his financial portfolio, his trembling thumb swiping frantically to his secondary personal banking application. The digital slaughter was absolute. His personal savings, his checking accounts, and his exclusive wealth management portfolios were completely seized and ruthlessly zeroed out to satisfy the massive collateral demands of the toxic bridge loan. The luxurious, untouchable wealth he had gleefully celebrated less than 24 hours ago had been entirely eradicated. The offshore creditors had systematically gutted his entire financial existence in a matter of seconds, executing the ironclad terms of service he had blindly authorized. He had personally handed them the legal scalpel to dissect his fraudulent empire. Blake watched the bright red text confirming absolute bankruptcy burn into his retinas, realizing his monumental arrogance had just cost him every single penny he had ever stolen, earned, or borrowed. He was no longer a visionary titan. He was a desperate, ruined criminal waiting to be heavily prosecuted. He was instantly, unequivocally bankrupt, completely stripped of his entire corporate identity, and entirely exposed to the severe legal ramifications of monumental intellectual property theft. The digital destruction was a flawless, merciless execution, orchestrated entirely from the shadows. The elevator gently chimed, arriving perfectly at the concrete basement level. The heavy steel doors glided open, releasing them into the cold, harsh reality of the dimly lit parking structure as Blake slowly lowered the phone, his luxurious world annihilated. Blake stumbled forward out of the express elevator, his tailored Italian suit sagging against his defeated posture. He held the glowing smartphone out toward his wife with severely trembling hands. Kendra snatched the device aggressively from his weak grasp, her manicured nails digging sharply into the metal casing. She scanned the devastating cascade of red notifications, her flawless, curated facade violently shattering into pure, unhinged rage. The pristine, cavernous underground parking garage echoed loudly as she began to scream at him at the absolute top of her lungs. Her piercing voice bounced harshly off the concrete pillars, viciously tearing into Blake's completely broken ego. She explicitly realized in one agonizing, catastrophic second that the magnificent corporate titan she had proudly married was actually nothing more than a pathetic, penniless fraud entirely exposed to the world. The incredibly heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone suddenly felt like a heavy, suffocating iron chain, physically binding her directly to his monumental criminal failure. She hurled the expensive smartphone violently against the concrete floor, shattering the glass screen into 1,000 sparkling pieces. Blake shrank backward, utterly paralyzed by her explosive fury and his own irreversible financial doom. He desperately stammered out that they were going directly to a federal prison for massive corporate fraud. Kendra abruptly stopped screaming, her sharp predatory instincts slicing cleanly through her towering panic. She locked her cold, ruthless eyes directly onto his terrified face, as the ultimate survival strategy finally materialized in her completely desperate mind. She explicitly reminded him that her father's pristine suburban estate was technically still under their legal control pending the scheduled demolition. The extremely valuable suburban land was literally the only remaining unseized financial asset legally available to completely save their utterly ruined lives from absolute total legal destruction today right now. Kendra aggressively grabbed Blake by the lapels of his ruined designer suit, forcefully pulling him toward their luxury sports car parked in the VIP section. She yelled at him to get directly into the passenger seat immediately, entirely taking control of the desperate, rapidly deteriorating situation. She explicitly ordered him to instantly contact his most unscrupulous real estate broker right now. She wildly demanded that he illegally force a massive, completely untraceable cash sale of her father's massive suburban estate to any available shady buyer within the absolute next hour. They absolutely needed to aggressively liquidate the valuable property entirely off the books and physically secure the physical cash before the offshore bank's automated collection software officially identified and legally seized the deed as collateral. Kendra violently slammed the driver's side door shut, aggressively gunning the powerful engine as she ruthlessly navigated out of the dark concrete parking garage. She stared intensely at the road ahead, her mind racing with pure, unadulterated survival instincts. They were aggressively racing directly against a ticking digital clock to safely save themselves from total destruction today. She firmly believed they could still outsmart the massive corporate financial trap tightening brutally around their guilty necks. The extremely powerful engine of Blake's luxury sports car roared with a desperate mechanical agony as he aggressively slammed his expensive leather shoe onto the accelerator pedal. They tore through the narrow city streets, recklessly weaving through the dense morning traffic with absolute unhinged panic driving their every maneuver. Kendra gripped the leather dashboard with completely pale knuckles, her chest heaving as she stared blindly ahead. They were completely consumed by the frantic singular objective of legally stealing her father's pristine suburban estate before the offshore banking network finalized their total financial ruin. Blake wildly wrenched the steering wheel to the right, taking the final suburban corner at a dangerously high speed. The heavy rubber tires shrieked violently against the rough asphalt, leaving thick black streaks across the quiet residential road. He aggressively lined the vehicle up with the familiar cobblestone driveway of the sprawling property, fully intending to charge directly up to the front portico. He suddenly slammed both feet onto the heavy brake pedal. The sports car skidded violently forward, halting mere inches from a massive, unexpected barricade. Blake and Kendra threw their respective doors open and scrambled frantically onto the pavement. The previously open, welcoming entrance to the expansive estate was entirely blocked. Heavy, thick industrial steel chains were tightly wrapped and securely padlocked across the massive wrought iron gates. The thick metal links physically barred any vehicle or pedestrian from accessing the manicured grounds. Blake stood paralyzed on the edge of the public street, staring blankly at the cold steel barrier, denying him his ultimate financial salvation. The pristine suburban sanctuary had been entirely transformed into an impenetrable, locked fortress during the exact hours he had been arrogantly celebrating his fraudulent corporate victory. His chest heaved as the terrifying reality of the heavy physical blockade finally fully set in. Blake stepped aggressively toward the immovable iron barricade, his eyes locking onto a massive, freshly mounted metal sign securely bolted directly into the center of the heavy front gate. The crisp, official black lettering painted across the bright white aluminum surface explicitly declared that the entire sprawling property now legally belonged entirely to a prominent local youth foundation. The bold text clearly stated the expansive estate was officially registered as a completely protected philanthropic trust, permanently shielding the valuable land from any private commercial development or immediate corporate sale. Blake stared at the absolute legal finality printed on the solid metal rectangle, his shattered mind utterly unable to physically process the devastating magnitude of this quiet, lethal counterattack. The massive, beautiful house he desperately needed to illegally liquidate to avoid federal prison was already permanently gone. He had entirely lost his absolute last remaining financial lifeline. A profound, terrifying psychological snap violently severed his remaining tethers to rational thought. He went absolutely berserk, his entire body trembling with a vicious, uncontrollable fury. He spun around and sprinted aggressively back toward his luxury sports car, completely ignoring Kendra's panicked, desperate questions echoing loudly behind him. He reached the rear of the expensive vehicle and forcefully threw open the trunk wildly, throwing designer luggage and emergency roadside kits across the clean asphalt. His frantic hands violently grasped a heavy, solid steel tire iron. He yanked the brutal metal weapon from the dark compartment and charged ferociously back toward the locked entrance. Blake raised the heavy iron bar high above his head and viciously smashed it directly downward onto the thick brass padlock securing the heavy industrial chains. The deafening crack of solid steel striking metal rang brutally through the quiet suburban neighborhood. He violently and repeatedly bashed the thick and heavy metal locks, viciously shattering the bright white philanthropic sign into jagged, dented fragments. His very expensive and tailored Italian suit ripped completely across his broad shoulders as he relentlessly pounded the heavy barricade in a state of pure, terrifying, animalistic madness. He was wildly attempting to physically smash his way into a totally lost fortune, entirely consumed by the absolute catastrophic reality of his immediate permanent corporate and personal destruction today. 3 fully marked police cruisers suddenly turned the corner at the exact same moment, their bright red and blue emergency lights violently painting the quiet suburban street. Piercing, deafening sirens instantly drowned out the aggressive metallic impacts of Blake's heavy tire iron against the ruined steel gate. Hollis had meticulously anticipated this exact unhinged physical reaction from his incredibly volatile relative. Several days prior, he had personally visited every single adjacent property and explicitly instructed his deeply loyal trusted neighbors to immediately contact emergency dispatchers at the very first visual or auditory sign of any violent disturbance occurring at his gated entrance. The coordinated trap functioned with absolute flawless precision. The 3 speeding police vehicles skidded aggressively to a sharp halt directly behind Blake's illegally parked luxury sports car, completely blocking any physical possibility of a rapid vehicular escape. 6 heavily armed police officers threw open their doors and poured out onto the asphalt, instantly assessing the chaotic, incredibly dangerous situation. They immediately unholstered their standard-issue service weapons, aiming the dark muzzles directly at the screaming, utterly deranged tech executive actively wielding a heavy steel weapon. The commanding officer stepped securely behind his armored vehicle door and shouted a booming, authoritative order through a heavy black megaphone. He explicitly commanded Blake to instantly drop the solid metal tire iron and get entirely face-flat down onto the rough concrete surface right now. Blake froze in absolute terror, his heavy chest violently heaving as he stared blankly at the overwhelming lethal police presence, completely and totally surrounding him. The heavy metal weapon slipped slowly from his sweating, trembling hands, clattering loudly onto the driveway. He slowly dropped to his knees, utterly defeated, and pressed his bruised, dirty face completely flat against the cold, unforgiving suburban concrete pavement right now today. 2 rapidly advancing officers swiftly pinned Blake forcefully against the rough pavement, brutally clicking heavy steel handcuffs tightly around his writhing wrists. The commanding officer calmly approached the deeply hyperventilating couple and explicitly informed the terrified, screaming perpetrators that the vast suburban property was legally and irrevocably donated exactly 3 days ago. Hollis had meticulously transferred the entire verified deed directly to the local youth foundation long before the offshore bank could ever legally register their fraudulent collateral claims. Blake was officially and completely arrested for severe armed trespassing, vicious destruction of private property, and resisting a lawful municipal order. The absolute finality of their monumental financial trap snapped shut permanently. Kendra shrieked hysterically, desperately, attempting to flee toward the locked iron gate, but another stern officer aggressively intercepted her path. He physically restrained her flailing arms, forcefully throwing the weeping, entirely ruined woman directly into the dark, enclosed back seat of a waiting police cruiser. She slammed her fists violently against the thick plexiglass window, screaming desperately and pathetically for her father to magically appear and save her. The massive, flawlessly executed corporate and personal vengeance of Hollis Vance was now beautifully, completely, and utterly finalized everywhere forever today. The automated robotic voice of the county correctional facility operator broke the serene silence of my expansive new downtown penthouse. I stood beside the massive glass windows looking out over the sprawling city skyline as the metallic voice requested authorization to accept a collect call from an inmate. I pressed the necessary button on my encrypted smartphone, officially bridging the secure connection to the desperate holding cell. The immediate sound of Kendra sobbing hysterically flooded the digital receiver. Her breathing was ragged, punctuated by sharp theatrical gasps meticulously designed to project absolute victimhood and severe emotional distress. She wept loudly into the communal jailhouse phone, aggressively portraying herself as a terrified innocent hostage trapped entirely against her will within the cold concrete walls of the municipal detention center. I remained perfectly still against the pristine glass, listening to the chaotic symphony of her manufactured panic. She wailed about the harsh, unforgiving conditions of the overcrowded cell block, crying that she was completely traumatized by the aggressive police officers who had ruthlessly forced her into the back of the cruiser. Her voice cracked with practiced precision, painting a vivid picture of a deeply terrified daughter who had been maliciously swept up in a terrifying corporate misunderstanding. She continued to sob with unrelenting intensity, desperately hoping her loud performative misery would instantly shatter my resolve and force me into immediate unconditional submission. The sprawling penthouse suite remained utterly silent, absorbing the toxic frequency of her lies without offering a single echo of comfort. I simply held the device securely to my ear, waiting patiently for her to exhaust her dramatic opening performance. I did not interrupt her loud weeping or offer a single syllable of fatherly reassurance. I allowed her to spin her pathetic, desperate narrative entirely uninterrupted right away this very morning. Kendra violently cleared her throat, aggressively shifting her calculated performance into its absolute most manipulative phase yet. She desperately begged me to immediately post their exorbitant bail and completely pay off Blake's catastrophic corporate debts right now. She wildly claimed that they were both facing decades in federal prison unless I generously stepped forward to fully rescue her ruined life. Her words spilled rapidly through the receiver, morphing seamlessly into an absolutely blatant, disgusting fabrication regarding the tragic circumstances of her mother's deliberate murder. She explicitly lied aggressively, claiming that Blake had violently forced her to physically alter Nadine's delicate medical care under extreme duress. She had the absolute audacity to scream that she was secretly working behind the scenes the entire time, desperately trying to protect her vulnerable mother from his lethal intentions. She painted Blake as an abusive, monstrous tyrant who had viciously manipulated her innocent obedience through severe physical threats and intense psychological control. It was an incredibly vile, desperate narrative constructed entirely to completely absolve herself of any criminal culpability whatsoever. She seamlessly transitioned from these massive falsehoods into employing every single deeply ingrained emotional trigger she had successfully learned from her privileged childhood. She softly whimpered my first name using the exact same delicate pleading tone she had frequently utilized as a little girl whenever she wanted unconditional forgiveness for a broken vase or a ruined dress. She cried that she was still my precious little girl, desperately needing her strong father to heroically save her from the dark monsters hiding safely under the bed. She aggressively weaponized decades of my absolute unconditional paternal love, viciously twisting my deepest protective instincts to force an immediate, massive financial bailout. She explicitly promised she would completely divorce Blake and return home to unconditionally take care of me forever if I just paid the angry offshore bank immediately today. She frantically repeated her deeply toxic promises, totally convinced that the sheer emotional weight of her fake tears would finally blind me to the absolute irrefutable truth. Her performance was a total masterclass in sociopathic manipulation, utilizing profound familial grief as a cheap tool to completely erase her massive, unforgivable betrayal. She truly believed her fake innocence would successfully secure her total permanent salvation completely intact right now, without any severe legal consequences ever happening to her, going entirely forward into the distant future, starting exactly right now, today. I listened to the entirety of her pathetic, desperately fabricated monologue with a face made of absolute, unforgiving stone. I stood completely motionless inside the lavish, sunlit penthouse, staring coldly out across the sprawling urban landscape stretching endlessly beyond the pristine glass. My heartbeat remained perfectly steady, entirely unregulated by the frantic, chaotic wailing violently echoing through the secure digital receiver pressed firmly against my ear. I did not display a single ounce of human empathy, nor did I allow even the slightest trace of paternal weakness to soften the absolute rigidity of my silent posture. The intense, blinding grief that had once completely paralyzed my soul following Nadine's brutal murder had now thoroughly solidified into an impenetrable frozen armor. I allowed Kendra to fully exhaust the very last drops of her manic, breathless energy until only quiet, pathetic whimpers remained transmitting across the secure jailhouse line. When her desperate weeping pleas finally subsided into a strained, exhausted silence, I calmly broke my rigid silence. I spoke with a quiet, terrifyingly measured cadence that instantly froze the remaining oxygen in her lungs. I smoothly agreed to formally meet with them to legally resolve the catastrophic, entirely self-inflicted situation. However, I explicitly and firmly refused to ever physically step a single foot inside the miserable, filthy confines of the county detention facility to conduct this final transaction. I ruthlessly stated that a man of my immense, carefully protected corporate stature absolutely does not conduct critical financial business within the degrading, humiliating environment of a dirty municipal holding cell under any conceivable circumstances whatsoever. I commanded her to silently listen very carefully to my absolute non-negotiable terms for her potential, highly conditional rescue occurring completely today, right now, in this very single exact specific instant, before abruptly hanging the heavy phone up. I issued my ultimate inflexible directive with absolute chilling authority. I explicitly demanded that Kendra physically bring her court-appointed public defender directly to Attorney Gallagher's secure, heavily fortified downtown corporate office, precisely at 9 o'clock sharp the very next morning. I firmly stated that they must arrive perfectly on time without a single second of delay, completely prepared to thoroughly review my legally binding, ironclad surrender documentation. I explicitly warned her that any failure to immediately meet this exact scheduling requirement would automatically completely void my incredibly generous offer forever. Kendra opened her mouth, desperately gasping for air, as she aggressively attempted to immediately formulate yet another pathetic, convoluted lie to excuse her catastrophic failure. I absolutely refused to allow her toxic voice to infect my peaceful reality for another single second. With one swift, decisive motion, I violently pressed the red disconnect button on my encrypted smartphone. I abruptly terminated the secure holding cell connection completely mid-sentence, permanently silencing her desperate, manipulative wailing. I calmly slipped the slim device directly back into my tailored suit jacket, turning my gaze proudly toward the bright city skyline. The final massive trap was flawlessly set, and absolute crushing justice was officially arriving tomorrow. The sprawling, meticulously polished mahogany table in Attorney Gallagher's primary downtown conference room felt remarkably cold and unforgiving. The expansive, soundproof glass walls offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the bustling morning financial district, yet the two individuals seated near the far end of the room looked entirely defeated. Kendra sat rigidly in a heavy leather chair, her pristine, carefully curated image completely destroyed. Her expensive designer makeup was terribly smudged, leaving dark, chaotic streaks across her pale, terrified cheeks. The luxurious emerald green silk dress she had so proudly flaunted the previous evening was deeply wrinkled, stained with the undeniable grime of a miserable, sleepless night spent curled on a rigid metal bench inside a concrete municipal holding cell. She aggressively chewed her thumbnail, her eyes darting nervously toward the heavy oak double doors every single time a moving shadow passed in the outer corridor. Blake sat slumped directly beside her, a pathetic, shivering shell of the arrogant corporate titan who had confidently toasted his massive, fraudulent victory just hours ago. His custom-tailored Italian suit was torn across the right shoulder, permanently ruined by his frantic, unhinged assault on the steel security gates, legally blocking the suburban estate. His wrists bore dark, ugly red abrasions from the tightly ratcheted police handcuffs. He stared blankly at the polished wood grain, his shoulders trembling with a toxic mixture of intense caffeine withdrawal and profound, suffocating financial terror. Their exhausted, overworked public defender sat quietly at the opposite corner of the table, nervously reviewing a thin stack of preliminary legal documents. The immense, crushing weight of their catastrophic reality pressed down heavily upon the silent room. They were entirely stripped of their stolen wealth, utterly humiliated, and waiting desperately for a miraculous, unconditional rescue from the very man they had viciously, repeatedly discarded. The heavy double oak doors at the front of the executive conference room finally swung open with a resounding, authoritative click. Kendra immediately shot upward in her plush leather chair, her mouth opening to loudly deploy another meticulously rehearsed, tearful fabrication. The pathetic words died instantly in her dry throat. I walked purposefully across the threshold, projecting an aura of absolute, uncompromising power that instantly dominated the entire corporate space. I was transformed. I was no longer wearing the faded, dusty work clothes or the scuffed boots of a forgotten, technologically illiterate old mechanic. I was impeccably dressed in a flawless, midnight blue, custom-tailored Tom Ford suit that draped perfectly across my broad shoulders. The premium silk fabric caught the morning sunlight streaming through the massive penthouse windows, accentuating the crisp, razor-sharp lines of the bespoke garment. My posture was entirely rigid, my spine perfectly straight, and my chin held remarkably high. I moved with a terrifying, undeniable authority that instantly commanded absolute silence from every single person occupying the room. I did not offer a comforting, paternal smile or project even a microscopic fraction of emotional vulnerability. I was a ruthless corporate apex predator stepping confidently onto my rightful battleground. I completely ignored the gasps of absolute shock radiating from my treacherous daughter and her ruined husband. I walked with deliberate, heavy footsteps directly toward the designated seat of absolute power located at the very head of the expansive mahogany table. I smoothly unbuttoned my premium suit jacket and took my seat in the tall, imposing leather chair anchoring the room. Attorney Gallagher stepped smoothly through the open doorway immediately behind me, carrying a thick, locked leather portfolio. He did not sit alongside the frantic, shivering couple or their thoroughly confused public defender. He walked with brisk, professional purpose and took up a highly respectful subordinate position, standing perfectly straight directly at my right shoulder. He placed his hands politely behind his back, physically demonstrating his absolute professional allegiance solely to my ultimate command. Kendra stared at me with her mouth hanging open, her terrified mind aggressively attempting to process the impossible, dominating metamorphosis happening right before her tear-streaked face. Blake simply gripped the edge of the wooden table with severely shaking fingers, his bloodshot eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated horror as the immense, terrifying gravity of the drastically shifted power dynamic finally began to brutally crush his shattered ego. Attorney Gallagher did not allow the suffocating tension to linger in the silent conference room for another second. He cleared his throat with a sharp professional cough, adjusting his premium silk tie before formally addressing the utterly bewildered public defender sitting across the expansive table. Gallagher spoke with a chilling, crystal-clear enunciation, explicitly introducing my true corporate identity to the completely paralyzed room. He formally announced that I was absolutely not a retired, impoverished suburban mechanic relying on a pathetic municipal pension. He definitively proclaimed that I was actually the sole original founder, primary visionary software architect, and current acting chairman of the massive executive board for Vanguard Holdings. The monumental, terrifying revelation instantly struck Blake and Kendra with the devastating, crushing force of a massive physical freight train. The vibrant color drained entirely from Kendra's pale, tear-stained face as she collapsed backward against her leather chair. She physically gasped for air, her lungs completely seizing as the massive, inescapable reality brutally paralyzed her nervous system. Blake's shaking jaw dropped downward in sheer, unadulterated terror. He stared blindly across the polished mahogany, mentally reviewing every single catastrophic failure he had experienced over the past 48 hours. The devastating realization rapidly crystallized in his shattered, panicking mind. He finally understood that every single insurmountable financial hurdle, the sudden massive bridge loan approval, the lethal intellectual property audit, and the completely ruined municipal acquisition, were not strings of terrible luck. Every single punishing obstacle had been meticulously, flawlessly orchestrated from the absolute beginning by the silent, brilliant man sitting powerfully directly across from him. Blake violently realized he had arrogantly stolen my proprietary software just to blindly sell it straight back into my very own corporate empire. He had unknowingly walked his entire fraudulent existence directly into my waiting lethal execution chamber. Blake abruptly launched his heavy body out of the wooden chair, his face flushing a deep, furious crimson. He was absolutely drowning in supreme, blinding humiliation. He desperately pointed a severely trembling finger directly at my chest, furiously screaming that he would ruthlessly sue my entire corporate conglomerate for massive illegal market manipulation and blatant financial entrapment. He aggressively yelled that I had maliciously orchestrated a highly vindictive conspiracy strictly designed to ruin his innocent livelihood. He wildly swore he would publicly expose my illegal, tyrannical corporate methods and aggressively drag my pristine name through the federal courtroom mud. I remained completely unaffected by his chaotic, pathetic tantrum. I did not dignify his unhinged, screaming threats with a single spoken response. I simply reached across the polished mahogany table and picked up a small black remote control resting near my leather portfolio. Maintaining unwavering, icy eye contact with the screaming fraud, I calmly pressed my thumb firmly against the primary activation button. The secure high-definition wall monitor positioned directly behind Attorney Gallagher instantly flared to life, casting an incredibly cold, bright digital glow directly across Blake's deeply terrified, completely silenced face right now today in this precise room forever entirely. The massive high-definition monitor bolted securely to the far wall of Attorney Gallagher's immaculate conference room instantly flared to life, casting an incredibly sharp, uncompromising digital glare across the silent space. The crisp screen bypassed any preliminary loading sequences and immediately initiated the playback of a meticulously preserved, heavily encrypted video file. The crystal-clear footage was undeniably damning, captured entirely from the hidden surveillance camera Hollis had discreetly embedded within the living room smoke detector of his suburban estate weeks ago. The digital playback flawlessly depicted the exact horrifying reality of the violent home invasion that had occurred on the night of the brutal confrontation. The silent, captivated audience watched in absolute paralyzed horror as the high-definition recording explicitly showcased Blake aggressively lunging forward and viciously tackling Hollis directly onto the hardwood floor. The digital audio track was completely unmistakable, broadcasting Blake's unhinged, screaming voice with terrifying clarity throughout the expansive corporate room. He viciously pinned the older man's shoulders against the unforgiving floorboards, violently brandishing a thick legal document directly in his bruised face. The pristine corporate speakers blasted every single disgusting, venomous racial slur Blake had weaponized during his unhinged tirade, exposing the raw, ugly prejudice festering entirely beneath his expensive designer suits. The footage explicitly captured Blake ruthlessly, physically threatening the immobilized mechanic, aggressively screaming at the absolute top of his lungs, and violently demanding an immediate, legally binding signature to completely surrender the incredibly valuable suburban property. The undeniable high-resolution evidence of severe physical assault and blatant extortion played out in a merciless, unalterable loop, entirely stripping away Blake's meticulously crafted public persona. He was explicitly revealed to the entire room as nothing more than a desperate, violent, racially motivated thug utilizing raw physical intimidation to forcefully extract immense financial wealth from a completely grieving widower. Blake instantly froze in absolute mind-numbing terror as the incredibly damning video flawlessly completed its playback cycle. The warm blood drained entirely from his flushed face, instantly transforming his previously enraged complexion into a sickly, terrifying shade of translucent white. His vocal cords completely paralyzed, rendering him utterly incapable of physically uttering a single syllable of useless defense or pathetic denial. Before his thoroughly shattered ego could even attempt to aggressively process the monumental legal implications of the first digital file, the massive conference monitor abruptly shifted. The unyielding screen immediately displayed the second devastating piece of unalterable multimedia evidence. It was the original, completely unhacked hospital security footage meticulously retrieved and securely decrypted directly from the hidden wall drive Hollis had quietly removed weeks ago. The grainy, time-stamped video from the intensive care unit definitively eliminated any remaining trace of plausible deniability. The high-contrast black and white footage explicitly showed Blake aggressively entering Nadine's private hospital room during the highly restricted, entirely unmonitored midnight shift. The digital camera lens flawlessly captured him stepping stealthily across the linoleum floor, moving with the highly calculated precision of a deeply experienced, ruthless predator. The undeniable, crystal-clear recording explicitly documented him physically leaning directly over the critically ill, completely comatose woman. He violently and deliberately tampered with the sophisticated, life-sustaining intravenous delivery machine, manually altering the precise doctor-mandated chemical dosage flowing directly into her fragile bloodstream. The horrifying visual evidence permanently cemented his direct, undeniable involvement in her subsequent fatal medical crash. Furthermore, the incredibly damning hospital surveillance footage did not exclusively implicate Blake in the brutal, calculated homicide. The wide-angle security camera, positioned securely and directly in the sterile, cold, fluorescent-lit hallway, vividly captured Kendra standing completely rigid exactly outside the heavy wooden hospital room door. She was explicitly standing absolute dedicated, watch her head nervously pivoting back and forth to actively scan the extremely quiet corridor for any rapidly approaching nurses or patrolling medical staff. Her documented physical presence entirely shattered her hysterical, completely pathetic jailhouse narrative of innocent coercion and passive ignorance. The absolute digital evidence explicitly proved that she was indeed a completely willing, highly active, and fully participating accomplice in the deliberate malicious execution of her own completely defenseless mother. They were now both permanently, securely, and legally bound directly to the undeniable reality of their incredibly monstrous joint criminal conspiracy playing out brightly upon the massive screen. The massive screen flickered once more, quickly transitioning seamlessly into the final utterly devastating piece of verified digital evidence today. A highly complex scrolling sequence of raw hospital network access logs flooded the glowing monitor, accompanied by a perfectly synchronized decrypted audio recording. The undeniable electronic transmission explicitly broadcasted the precise, heavily encrypted commands Blake had maliciously executed to completely infiltrate the secure municipal medical database. The pristine corporate speakers projected the cold mechanical keystrokes alongside the automated system voice, confirming the absolute deletion of Nadine's critical toxicology reports. The scrolling forensic data explicitly pinpointed his exact IP address, completely exposing the sophisticated, multi-layered digital camouflage he had arrogantly assumed was entirely untraceable. He had ruthlessly manipulated the primary medical records to perfectly align with his fabricated narrative of a natural expected heart failure, completely erasing the massive lethal chemical spike he had intentionally administered mere hours prior. The expansive conference room remained utterly silent, completely overwhelmed by the sheer staggering magnitude of the flawless forensic presentation. Every single horrific calculated crime they had jointly committed during their violent rampage, from severe elder abuse and blatant extortion to premeditated first-degree capital murder and massive digital tampering, which was meticulously documented, completely verified, and perfectly legally admissible in any federal courtroom. This absolutely inescapable, ironclad digital evidence entirely dismantled their pathetic, crumbling facades, leaving absolutely no conceivable margin for legal negotiation or deceitful maneuvering. They were now entirely stripped of their expensive lawyers, their stolen corporate wealth, and their incredibly arrogant, suffocating entitlement. The undeniable, perfectly objective truth hung heavily in the cold, strictly conditioned air, wrapping a permanent, suffocating legal noose directly around their trembling, guilty throats. They were completely paralyzed, explicitly realizing they had foolishly handed their absolute destruction directly to the most powerful, unforgiving man in the city. I smoothly reached inside my premium leather portfolio and deliberately extracted an extremely thick, heavily weighted manila file. I casually dropped the dense dossier directly onto the polished mahogany table. The sharp, incredibly heavy thud instantly shattered the stifling, deeply terrified silence entirely consuming the expansive conference room. Maintaining my incredibly cold, uncompromising eye contact with the weeping, thoroughly broken couple, I calmly and officially announced my ultimate, inescapable checkmate. I explicitly and formally stated that completely certified, unalterable digital copies of every single piece of devastating multimedia evidence currently illuminating the wall monitor had already been officially submitted. I ruthlessly detailed that the massive cache of verified files was physically delivered precisely at dawn today to the primary district attorney, the elite federal cybercrime division, and the most aggressive local homicide detectives operating within the municipal precinct. The monumental reality of multiple overlapping federal and state capital investigations instantly vaporized their absolutely final microscopic shred of desperate hope. I coldly informed them that heavily armed tactical apprehension teams were currently surrounding the corporate building lobby right now, patiently waiting to escort them directly into permanent federal custody, entirely without any possibility of escape, starting exactly right now today, permanently. Blake stared at the massive high-definition monitor, his bloodshot eyes entirely consumed by the incredibly blinding reality of his inescapable doom. The immense, crushing weight of a guaranteed life sentence inside a federal penitentiary violently snapped his fragile psychological tethers. Confronted with the absolute certainty of spending his remaining decades trapped behind cold steel bars for first-degree murder, The last remaining shreds of his fabricated loyalty completely evaporated. He violently shoved his heavy leather chair backward, creating a harsh, echoing screech against the pristine floorboards. He instantly and ruthlessly turned on his perfectly manicured wife. He pointed a trembling, sweat-drenched finger directly at Kendra, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, unhinged scream of pure desperation. He wildly declared to the entire conference room that Kendra had meticulously planned the entire murderous conspiracy from the very beginning. He desperately attempted to rewrite the undeniable narrative, loudly claiming he was merely a reluctant pawn entirely manipulated by a sociopathic daughter desperate to secure her massive inheritance ahead of schedule. Blake viciously spat out the exact horrifying details of her dark web browsing history, explicitly screaming that Kendra had personally spent weeks researching the precise, lethal potassium dosage required to trigger a completely undetectable cardiac arrest. He vehemently insisted that she had physically purchased the toxic chemical compound and aggressively bullied him into delivering the fatal injection under the severe threat of exposing his massive corporate fraud. He portrayed her as a ruthless, calculating monster who callously viewed her own mother as a disposable financial obstacle. Every single desperate, chaotic word violently erupting from his trembling mouth was explicitly designed to totally sacrifice his terrified wife to the advancing authorities in a pathetic, completely futile attempt to miraculously salvage his own permanently ruined existence right here today in this absolutely doomed corporate room. Kendra absorbed his vicious accusations with a completely paralyzed expression before an explosive animalistic rage suddenly hijacked her entire nervous system. The pristine, elegant facade she had maintained for decades instantly shattered into a million jagged pieces of pure, unadulterated venom. With a terrifying, guttural shriek, she violently launched herself directly across the wide expanse of the polished mahogany boardroom table. She aggressively tackled Blake with horrifying momentum, sending them both crashing brutally against the heavy wooden surface. Her manicured hands transformed into vicious claws, aggressively scratching deeply into his flushed cheeks and violently tearing the premium silk fabric of his ruined Italian shirt. She completely abandoned any lingering concept of self-preservation, opting instead for total mutual destruction. She screamed full, entirely unedited criminal confessions at the absolute top of her lungs, letting the horrifying truth echo wildly off the soundproof glass walls. She furiously blamed his rapidly failing technological company and his massive hidden offshore debts for ruthlessly forcing her desperate hand. She explicitly shrieked that Blake was a pathetic, incompetent failure who had entirely drained their joint accounts and borrowed heavily from dangerous, unforgiving foreign lenders. She viciously confessed that they had both actively poisoned her own mother simply because Blake was completely terrified of facing federal bankruptcy and long-term imprisonment for his monumental financial crimes. They aggressively hurled devastating, highly specific legal accusations directly at one another, violently tearing each other apart with every single shrieking revelation. Blake violently shoved her backward, loudly countering that she was the primary architect of the financial theft, actively directing him to unlawfully forge her father's signature on the massive estate transfer documents. Kendra fiercely retaliated explicitly, detailing his highly illegal manipulation of the proprietary source code he had arrogantly attempted to sell. They effectively laid out an immaculate, completely verified roadmap of their entire criminal enterprise, freely handing the prosecution every single missing puzzle piece required to guarantee 2 maximum consecutive life sentences. The violent, chaotic brawl perfectly highlighted the absolute depths of their shared, irredeemable depravity. They were 2 monstrous, greedy parasites trapped entirely inside a rapidly sinking ship, viciously attempting to violently drown the other in a pathetic effort to secure a final, useless breath of air. They continuously screamed horrifying, totally admissible facts loudly into the heavily monitored room, effectively sealing their bleak fate forever as they brutally, physically assaulted one another without any mercy whatsoever today. I sat in perfect, absolutely motionless silence at the head of the massive mahogany table, watching the 2 despicable people who had brutally murdered my beloved wife entirely destroy each other. I did not attempt to interrupt their chaotic, bloody brawl, nor did I instruct my attorney to legally intervene in the incredibly violent physical assault playing out directly in front of us. I merely observed their pathetic, shrieking collapse with an incredibly steady, completely unblinking gaze. I searched my heart deeply for any lingering trace of sorrow or anger, but the profound, blinding grief that had once threatened to completely consume my entire soul had been entirely replaced by a highly dense, impenetrable armor of absolute, icy resolve. I felt no joy in witnessing my own biological daughter aggressively tear at her husband's face, nor did I feel any underlying sadness regarding the catastrophic, permanent destruction of her entire ruined life. I only felt the incredibly pure, intensely cold satisfaction of executing absolute, unyielding clinical justice. They were actively finalizing their own total annihilation, gleefully providing every single required audio confession necessary to ensure they would permanently rot within a federal prison cell for the rest of their miserable natural lives. Every single vile accusation they aggressively hurled at one another acted as a heavy, rusted nail sealing their joint metaphorical coffin. My brilliant, beautiful Nadine had been violently ripped from this earth by their sheer, unadulterated financial greed, but her radiant memory was now perfectly avenged through this beautifully orchestrated, flawless corporate trap. I watched the violent, bloody spectacle with the absolute detachment of a skilled surgeon observing a highly successful, completely necessary amputation. The massive, festering cancer that had maliciously infected my entire family was finally being ruthlessly cut away forever today, completely and entirely right now. Attorney Gallagher remained completely still beside my imposing leather chair, his sharp eyes meticulously tracking the violent, bloody chaos rapidly unfolding across the polished mahogany table. He smoothly lifted his left arm, casually checking the expensive silver chronometer secured tightly around his wrist. He calmly met my unblinking gaze and offered a single, highly respectful nod of absolute confirmation. The meticulously calculated, strictly allotted time frame for their complete self-destruction had officially expired. Heavy, perfectly synchronized footsteps abruptly began to echo loudly within the pristine hallway located entirely outside the glass-walled boardroom. The distinct, terrifying sound of heavily armed tactical boots marching aggressively across the marble flooring grew significantly louder, with every passing second signaling the immediate arrival of absolute, unyielding federal justice. Kendra and Blake instantly froze in sheer terror, their bleeding, bruised hands violently pausing mid-strike as the overwhelming auditory reality brutally crashed directly into their frantic minds. The heavy brass handles securely fastened to the massive double oak doors slowly began to turn downward, right now. The incredibly powerful, inescapable mechanism of absolute legal retribution was actively breaching the room right now, today, instantly. The inescapable final corporate checkmate was flawlessly executed completely forever today, permanently right now. The massive double oak doors exploded inward with staggering force, ricocheting violently against the boardroom walls. 4 heavily armed municipal police detectives and 2 elite FBI cyber agents surged into the pristine corporate space. They moved with absolute terrifying tactical precision, their heavy combat boots pounding relentlessly against the polished floorboards. Their dark tactical gear and drawn service weapons instantly dominated the chaotic room, entirely suffocating any remaining trace of resistance. The commanding detective immediately locked his sights directly onto Blake, completely ignoring the luxurious surroundings and the ongoing physical altercation. 2 strong officers charged aggressively forward, grabbing Blake by his torn Italian shirt and forcefully ripping him away from the mahogany table. They viciously slammed his entire body directly against the soundproof glass wall, the brutal impact echoing sharply across the expansive room. Blake gasped painfully for air, his face utterly compressed against the cold pain as the officers violently wrenched his arms tightly behind his back. The distinct, terrifying sound of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting aggressively around his bruised wrists finalized his absolute physical capture. The 2 federal cyber agents immediately flanked the captured executive, securing his pockets and aggressively confiscating his remaining personal electronics to permanently preserve the massive digital evidence trail. Blake remained entirely paralyzed against the glass, his breath fogging the pristine window overlooking the financial district he had foolishly attempted to conquer. His bloodshot eyes darted wildly in sheer panic, completely unable to process the overwhelming, heavily armed reality brutally crushing his physical freedom. The officers maintained their absolute, uncompromising physical control over the trembling fraud, completely neutralizing his previous violent outburst. The pristine executive boardroom was entirely transformed into an active, highly secure federal crime scene, permanently ending his incredibly arrogant, utterly fabricated corporate reign directly right here and absolutely right now, today. The commanding municipal detective stepped aggressively forward, closing the short physical distance between himself and the completely restrained corporate fraud. He firmly planted his heavy tactical boots onto the immaculate carpet, entirely dominating the shattered executive. He reached into his dark utility vest, extracting a laminated federal arrest warrant completely covered in official government seals. The lead detective cleared his throat and began to formally recite the extremely severe criminal charges loudly across the sprawling boardroom. His booming voice echoed violently against the transparent glass walls, entirely merciless in its precise delivery. He officially arrested Blake for premeditated first-degree capital murder, massive international wire fraud, and incredibly severe elder abuse resulting directly in wrongful death. The crushing litany of absolute legal destruction explicitly confirmed that every single digital footprint and every hidden financial maneuver had been completely intercepted and meticulously documented. Kendra collapsed entirely, the overwhelming terror finally completely breaking her remaining psychological endurance. Her legs completely failed her, sending her plummeting violently downward. She dropped forcefully onto her bare knees on the thick premium carpet, her deeply wrinkled designer dress pooling pathetically around her shivering form. She instantly reverted directly back to her most desperate childish manipulation tactics, completely abandoning any remaining shred of adult dignity. She began violently weeping, hysterically large tears streaming rapidly down her severely smudged face as she shamelessly crawled across the floor toward the head of the long mahogany table. She stretched her trembling manicured hands out aggressively toward my polished leather shoes, desperately pleading for absolute mercy. Her voice cracked into a pathetic high-pitched shriek as she explicitly begged me to miraculously save her from this completely inescapable nightmare. She aggressively utilized her ultimate emotional weapon, loudly calling me her precious daddy over and over again while sobbing uncontrollably. She frantically promised that she would completely surrender everything and entirely obey my absolute command if I just utilized my massive wealth to legally protect her from the advancing federal authorities right now. Her completely fabricated, incredibly toxic wailing thoroughly saturated the silent room, vividly highlighting the absolute irredeemable depravity residing entirely within her very dark, deeply corrupted soul. She loudly pleaded for an entirely unearned, absolutely impossible salvation, genuinely expecting my profound grief to magically transform into immediate, unconditional forgiveness directly in front of the armed police precisely at this exact moment in time, without any further delay occurring right now. I remained entirely expressionless, looking directly downward at the weeping woman kneeling pathetically on the expensive carpet. As her trembling fingers frantically attempted to physically grasp the luxurious fabric of my custom-tailored trousers, I deliberately and coldly stepped backward. I smoothly removed myself completely from her incredibly desperate, sprawling reach, severing our physical connection entirely. Her hands violently grasped nothing but empty air as a highly trained female federal officer swiftly advanced across the room. The stern officer aggressively seized Kendra by her shaking shoulders, forcefully hauling the sobbing woman entirely off the carpet. She viciously secured Kendra's flailing hands tightly behind her back, explicitly stating she was officially under federal arrest for active criminal conspiracy to commit capital murder. As the heavy steel cuffs clicked securely into place, I spoke with a perfectly calm, deeply devastating clarity. I explicitly announced that my elite legal team had already formally successfully invoked the absolute ironclad Slayer rule across every single one of my massive financial portfolios. I ruthlessly explained that this definitive legal mandate completely and permanently disinherits any individual actively participating in a lethal crime against the primary benefactor. I informed her that she was now entirely and irrevocably legally blocked from accessing even a single penny of my vast corporate wealth. I forcefully clarified that her incredibly arrogant, murderous greed had completely guaranteed her absolute financial ruin forever. I explicitly stated she would now be brutally forced to legally fight her massive, absolutely inescapable capital murder charges, relying exclusively on a severely overworked, grossly underpaid municipal public defender. She was completely stripped of every single luxurious resource she had ruthlessly murdered her own mother, to falsely secure. Her absolute final destruction was flawlessly cemented into permanent reality right now today, directly in front of my very own eyes. The heavily armed tactical officers aggressively dragged the violently screaming couple directly out of the immaculate corporate boardroom. Kendra's hysterical, high-pitched wailing echoed pathetically down the long hallway, fading rapidly as the heavy elevator doors permanently sealed her grim fate. Blake remained entirely silent during his forced exit, completely paralyzed by his total destruction. The expansive room was finally perfectly quiet. My secure smartphone immediately began vibrating inside my tailored jacket pocket, aggressively shattering the newly established tranquility. I smoothly retrieved the glowing device and accepted the incoming encrypted call. Attorney Gallagher stood perfectly still beside me, silently waiting for my final directive. The frantic hospital administrator on the line frantically reported a highly volatile security situation actively unfolding in their main lobby. Blake's incredibly greedy, utterly despicable extended family had physically swarmed the medical facility. They were currently standing directly at the primary reception desk, aggressively demanding immediate, completely unauthorized access to Nadine's remaining private safety deposit box right now, today. The wretched parasites were already ruthlessly attempting to steal whatever meager scraps remained available. I slowly lowered the phone, staring coldly at the closed oak doors while plotting my exact legal move completely without any hesitation today. The heavy glass doors of the municipal hospital slid open, admitting Hollis into the sterile, brightly lit lobby. He bypassed the main reception desk and walked with deliberate, unhurried steps directly toward the executive administration wing. The chaotic noise of aggressive, entitled shouting grew significantly louder as he approached the frosted glass partitions. Inside the cramped administrative office, Blake's parents and his older brother stood in a rigid, intimidating formation around a terrified, completely overwhelmed hospital clerk. They were loudly demanding immediate, unsupervised access to Nadine's remaining private safety deposit box, aggressively waving a heavily forged, completely useless power of attorney document. Blake's father violently slammed his fist against the wooden counter, shouting that his brilliant son was simply delayed by a minor, insignificant corporate misunderstanding regarding a routine software acquisition. He arrogantly threatened the trembling clerk with massive legal retaliation, blindly insisting that their prominent family possessed the absolute right to secure their inherited assets right now, today. Blake's mother stood right beside him, wearing an expensive designer coat purchased with her son's stolen wealth, loudly echoing her husband's pathetic threats. She shrieked that they were extremely busy people and absolutely refused to wait another single minute for some pathetic, bureaucratic approval. The older brother aggressively leaned over the desk, attempting to physically intimidate the young hospital employee into handing over the master keys immediately. They operated with the exact same toxic, suffocating arrogance that Blake had weaponized for years, entirely convinced of their absolute invincibility. They genuinely believed the incredibly massive federal arrest currently destroying Blake and Kendra downtown was merely a temporary, easily resolved financial hiccup. They were aggressively attempting to pillage the absolute last remaining scraps of Nadine's legacy before the completely fabricated corporate mirage entirely evaporated completely right now, today, in this exact moment entirely. Hollis stepped smoothly through the frosted glass doorway, his immaculate custom suit projecting an immediate, terrifying aura of absolute authority. He did not yell, nor did he allow even a microscopic fraction of anger to visually surface across his hardened features. He simply walked directly toward the aggressive family, his piercing, unyielding gaze instantly silencing their chaotic, pathetic tantrums. Blake's father opened his mouth to arrogantly demand an explanation for the interruption, but the arrogant words died instantly in his dry throat. Hollis calmly reached inside his premium leather portfolio and smoothly extracted a thick, incredibly dense stack of highly certified legal documents. He deliberately placed the heavy file directly onto the wooden reception counter, loudly slapping his palm flat against the crisp white paper. Maintaining absolutely lethal, freezing eye contact with the sudden, terrified silence enveloping the room, he explicitly and systematically dismantled their entire greedy existence. He officially notified the completely paralyzed family that he had just formally filed a massive, incredibly devastating multi-million-dollar civil lawsuit directly against every single one of them today. He ruthlessly articulated that the incredibly aggressive legal action was entirely based on their active, undeniable participation in receiving heavily stolen financial funds, originating directly from Blake's highly illegal, completely fraudulent offshore bridge loan. He calmly explained that his elite team of forensic corporate accountants had meticulously traced every single stolen dollar Blake had generously gifted them over the past 3 years. Every single luxury vehicle, every pristine vacation home, and every incredibly expensive designer coat had been explicitly purchased utilizing stolen, heavily contested corporate capital. The sheer, crushing gravity of the massive federal and civil implications instantly struck the incredibly greedy family with the brutal absolute force of a physical blow. Hollis ruthlessly stated that his extremely aggressive civil lawsuit specifically targeted their personal banking accounts, their inherited family assets, and their completely unearned financial portfolios. He explicitly informed them that heavy, unyielding judicial injunctions had already been officially authorized, legally freezing every single financial resource they currently possessed across the entire global banking network. He was effectively holding them fully accountable for blindly ignoring the incredibly toxic, obviously criminal foundation of their son's entirely fabricated, completely false corporate empire. They stared blankly at the thick legal documents, absolutely horrified by the incredibly swift, entirely merciless retribution entirely surrounding their completely exposed, totally guilty lives right now, today, in this very room, forever, completely, permanently, instantly, entirely now. The devastating realization that their own personal homes, their extensive life savings, and their highly protected retirement pensions were at absolute immediate risk of total seizure completely shattered their arrogant facade. The suffocating toxic entitlement that had aggressively fueled their loud, demanding behavior entirely evaporated within seconds. Absolute primal panic violently hijacked their nervous systems as the monumental reality of Blake's catastrophic federal criminal indictment brutally destroyed their completely fabricated reality. They stared wildly at the incredibly thick legal documents resting heavily on the wooden counter, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of their impending financial annihilation. The absolute instinct for total, ruthless self-preservation instantly overwhelmed any lingering shred of familial loyalty or parental affection. In one breathtakingly cold, completely calculating instant, Blake's father violently rejected his incredibly disgraced son. He aggressively pointed a trembling finger directly at the heavy paperwork, loudly screaming that they had absolutely no prior knowledge of his deeply illegal corporate maneuvers. He explicitly declared that they were entirely innocent victims, maliciously manipulated by a completely sociopathic, incredibly selfish criminal. Blake's mother frantically echoed the absolutely ruthless betrayal, viciously disowning her youngest child completely to miraculously salvage her own pristine social standing and expensive jewelry collection. The older brother immediately backed away aggressively, severing all remaining family ties completely forever to legally protect his own unearned assets. They absolutely refused to physically support the ruined corporate fraud, explicitly sacrificing his entire existence to ruthlessly save themselves from total destruction. They scrambled frantically toward the heavy glass exit doors, desperately pushing past the bewildered hospital staff in absolute pathetic disgrace. They cowardly fled the municipal medical facility, sprinting wildly into the harsh morning sunlight, entirely abandoning their completely doomed, totally incarcerated relative directly into the unyielding hands of absolute federal justice today, right now, forever, completely. The cramped administration office cleared out entirely within seconds, leaving behind a profound, heavily ringing silence in the wake of the incredibly chaotic, pathetic family exodus. The terrified hospital clerk slowly exhaled, completely overwhelmed by the breathtaking magnitude of the ruthless corporate retribution executed directly across her wooden desk. The heavy frosted doors swung open gently, and the senior hospital director frantically approached, sweating profusely under his pristine white coat. He nervously adjusted his glasses, bowing his head respectfully and apologizing profusely to Hollis for the incredibly unfortunate, incredibly aggressive disturbance caused by the absolutely disgraceful intruders. He stammered desperate assurances that the entire medical facility remained entirely committed to securing Nadine's remaining legacy with absolute total operational perfection, moving completely forward today. Hollis did not offer a single word of empty reassurance or extend any polite corporate forgiveness to the incredibly terrified administrator. He simply nodded his head, once his face carved from impenetrable stone. He smoothly turned away from the reception counter, his polished leather shoes striking the pristine linoleum flooring with perfect, unyielding precision. He began walking completely alone down the exact same sterile, brightly lit medical corridor where this entire, unimaginable, devastating nightmare had brutally begun. The vibrant orange and deep violet hues of a fading sunset slowly descended upon the quiet municipal cemetery. Long, dark shadows stretched silently across the meticulously manicured lawns, blanketing the peaceful grounds in a solemn, fading twilight. Hollis stood perfectly still, a solitary figure anchored securely before the pristine, polished granite headstone bearing the deeply cherished name of his murdered wife. The evening air was exceptionally crisp and entirely motionless, carrying the absolute silence of a world finally restored to its natural balance. He wore a flawless, premium black custom suit that entirely absorbed the fading evening light, his posture perfectly rigid and unyielding against the cooling twilight breeze. He did not bow his head in overwhelming sorrow, nor did he allow his broad shoulders to physically slump under the immense weight of the preceding weeks. His sharp, calculating eyes remained completely dry, entirely devoid of any lingering, useless tears. He had already shed an ocean of profound grief during the darkest, most agonizing hours of his initial loss, and he explicitly refused to offer a single additional drop of sorrow to the cold earth today. Instead, he stared directly at the engraved golden lettering shining faintly upon the smooth stone surface. He spoke into the absolute silence with a quiet, incredibly steady voice that carried the heavy resonance of an unbreakable vow finally fulfilled entirely right now. He explicitly told Nadine that the ruthless, greedy monsters who had so viciously stolen her radiant life had been entirely vanquished forever. He assured her beautiful spirit that the incredibly toxic sociopathic parasites who had maliciously invaded their peaceful existence were completely neutralized, permanently locked away within cold concrete cages to rot for the remainder of their miserable natural lives. He had flawlessly executed absolute justice completely for her forever today, safely. Hollis stood quietly digesting the incredibly profound, extremely grim necessity of his own extreme, unyielding ruthlessness over the past several weeks. He deliberately allowed his highly calculated, completely analytical mind to methodically process the monumental magnitude of the absolute destruction he had intentionally orchestrated against his own biological flesh and blood. He firmly accepted the deeply undeniable, incredibly harsh reality that brutally excising his deeply toxic, incredibly sociopathic daughter from his life was the absolutely only possible way to permanently protect his personal dignity and officially honor her pristine, beautiful legacy. He completely acknowledged the fundamental, entirely immutable truth that offering blind, unconditional tolerance without enforcing absolute, impenetrable boundaries inevitably and consistently leads directly toward absolute personal and financial destruction for everyone involved. He had previously allowed a highly dangerous, incredibly manipulative parasite to completely infiltrate his peaceful suburban sanctuary, foolishly believing that unearned generosity would eventually cultivate genuine affection. He now explicitly understood that malignant, ungrateful greed could never be magically cured through continuous financial submission or constant enabling appeasement under any specific circumstances. It demanded absolute, total eradication to guarantee pure survival. His incredible, massive corporate empire was now completely securely protected from any future malicious infiltration, and his immense personal wealth was entirely shielded from the disgusting, grubby hands of lazy, incredibly entitled criminals, completely permanently. He had successfully, flawlessly reclaimed his entire vast conglomerate, his personal autonomy, and his profoundly deep internal peace today. He felt an incredibly refreshing, highly crisp wave of pure, unadulterated tranquility completely wash over his entire physical body, entirely washing away the lingering, putrid residue of the incredible, prolonged nightmare. The incredibly sharp, extremely heavy burden of constant suspicion and suffocating betrayal had been perfectly lifted from his broad shoulders forever today, right now. He had completely conquered the terrifying darkness, brutally purging the horrific infection entirely from his pristine existence, securing absolute safety for his entire remaining lifetime perfectly. He knew Nadine would proudly celebrate his massive victory today, completely unconditionally, forever and ever, right now, exactly. The immense, absolute power he truly held was completely, absolutely justified entirely. He thoroughly embraced his flawless, incredibly perfect, unyielding, completely permanent victory today, directly. His total unyielding, magnificent restoration was completed absolutely flawlessly today, perfectly. He would never again allow anyone to completely disrespect his immense authority or threaten his total peace forever, perfectly and entirely today, successfully, completely, and securely, always. Exactly 3 months later, the sprawling metropolitan skyline gleamed brightly outside the massive panoramic windows enclosing his incredibly sleek, highly modern corporate workspace, located securely within the towering Vanguard Holdings headquarters. The expansive, impeccably designed office radiated an aura of pristine, absolute operational perfection, completely devoid of any lingering shadows from the horrific, violent past. Hollis sat perfectly composed directly behind a massive custom-built frosted glass desk, his broad shoulders resting comfortably against a premium ergonomic leather chair. He wore a sharply tailored, perfectly fitted charcoal suit, projecting immense, undeniable executive authority across the completely silent room. His highly focused, calculating eyes meticulously scanned the incredibly thick, highly detailed legal document resting squarely upon the immaculate glass surface. With an incredibly steady, completely unyielding hand, he smoothly retrieved a heavy gold fountain pen and decisively signed his powerful name directly onto the final signature line. He officially authorized a remarkably massive, unprecedented financial grant permanently directing the incredibly vast corporate wealth to exclusively fund brilliant, heavily underrepresented technology entrepreneurs, originating entirely from historically marginalized, severely overlooked urban neighborhoods. He deliberately engineered this incredibly powerful multi-million-dollar philanthropic initiative to entirely bypass entitled, arrogant parasites and directly empower genuinely hungry, incredibly hardworking visionaries possessing absolute raw talent. He explicitly ensured that every single dollar previously hoarded by greedy, incredibly toxic criminals was entirely, completely redirected toward actively building completely legitimate, highly innovative technological futures for absolutely deserving individuals. His incredibly beautiful, perfectly brilliant wife had always deeply championed profound educational equality, and this incredibly massive, completely permanent financial endowment officially cemented her radiant legacy forever, perfectly today. He smiled incredibly warmly, perfectly satisfied, knowing her extraordinary, incredibly generous, magnificent spirit would definitively live onwards, completely, helping generations, flawlessly and perfectly forever, securely, entirely, permanently, right now, completely, exactly today. Hollis smoothly exited the towering glass building, stepping confidently directly into the incredibly bright, warming morning sunlight. The bustling metropolitan streets stretched endlessly before him, humming with vibrant, completely restored energy. The immense, sprawling world around him had been silently, flawlessly corrected. He stood incredibly tall upon the concrete pavement, entirely unburdened by any lingering sorrow or toxic obligation. He had masterfully purged the absolute worst imaginable darkness from his once shattered existence, entirely reclaiming his immense absolute sovereignty. A sleek, highly polished black luxury sedan sat idling perfectly curbside, silently awaiting his absolute command. He walked deliberately toward the waiting vehicle, his polished leather shoes striking the pristine pavement with incredible unyielding purpose. The heavy, dark-tinted door swung open flawlessly. He stepped smoothly inside the immaculate leather interior, decisively closing the heavy door securely behind him. The powerful, incredibly quiet engine hummed flawlessly to life, propelling the massive sedan smoothly forward into the busy traffic. Hollis stared directly ahead through the pristine windshield, his calculating eyes incredibly clear and perfectly sharp. He was finally living his entire life completely, absolutely, and entirely on his very own unyielding terms, right now, today, forever, perfectly, completely, and fully, happily, forever. True justice demands far more than merely reacting to terrible transgressions when they violently occur. It requires the incredibly profound absolute fortitude to systematically dismantle toxic entitlement without surrendering your own personal integrity during the chaotic process. Unconditional tolerance mistakenly applied toward deeply manipulative parasites fundamentally guarantees your own inevitable destruction. True peace is never accidentally discovered passively waiting in the background. It is aggressively, meticulously constructed by establishing completely impenetrable boundaries and ruthlessly enforcing them. Protecting your legacy absolutely requires removing venomous individuals entirely from your pristine environment, securing your complete sovereignty, and living strictly upon your own absolute terms. If you found this story compelling, please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing it with your friends. Leave a comment below letting me know which moment resonated the most with you today. Thank you for your continued support.